imagine the air in the spring of 1865. Take a deep breath. Can you feel it? It's not just the scent of damp earth and new blossoms. It's the scent of change, of something vast and momentous settling over the United States of America. For 4 long, brutal years, the nation had been tearing itself apart. The American Civil War, a conflict that pitted brother against brother, had drenched the land in blood and sorrow. But now, as the magnolias bloomed and the dogwoods flowered across the South, the guns were beginning to fall silent. The end was not a single, dramatic moment, but a slow, weary exhalation. It was a series of surrenders, a chain of events that signaled the final collapse of the Confederacy. In the cities, both North and South, the rhythm of life was hesitantly returning. In the North, factories that once churned out cannons and rifles were beginning to retool, their owners dreaming of a new industrial age. Streets that had been filled with parades of departing soldiers now saw the quiet, often somber, return of veterans. These men were heroes, but they were also ghosts, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed on fields like Gettysburg and Antietam. Down south, the change was even more profound and far more devastating. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta lay in ruins, their grand avenues now pathways of ash and rubble. The once proud plantation economy, built on the backs of enslaved people, had been shattered. For the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans, this was a moment of terrifying, exhilarating uncertainty. Freedom, a dream whispered in secret for generations, was finally a reality. But what did it mean? Where would they go? How would they build a life from nothing? This wasn't just the end of a war. It was the dawn of a new, undefined world. Across the entire nation, there was a deep, collective yearning. A yearning for peace, for rest, for healing. The cost of the war was staggering. Over 600,000 lives lost, countless more maimed in body and spirit. Every family, it seemed, had a story of loss. A husband who never came home, a son buried in an unmarked grave, a brother lost to the cause. The emotional toll was immeasurable. The nation was like a patient slowly waking from a fever dream, exhausted, disoriented, and covered in scars. People were desperate to put the conflict behind them. They wanted to rebuild their homes, replant their fields, and reconnect with loved ones separated by the battle lines. They wanted to believe in the promise of reunion, in the idea that the United States could once again be truly united. This hope was fragile, a flickering candle in the wind. The questions facing the country were immense. How do you bring a rebellious South back into the fold? How do you ensure the rights and safety of millions of newly freed people in a society that had only ever known them as property? How do you heal the deep wounds of hatred and division that the war had carved into the very soul of America? This was the America of 1865. A nation standing at a crossroads. It was a landscape of both ruin and possibility. The echoes of cannon fire were fading, replaced by the uncertain sounds of reconstruction. The air was thick with the dust of collapsed ideologies and the fresh scent of a new beginning. It was a nation at dawn, blinking in the new light, unsure of what the day would bring but desperately hoping for a brighter future. The journey of reconstruction was about to begin, and it would prove to be as challenging and transformative as the war that preceded it. This is the story of that journey, of a nation's struggle to be reborn from the ashes of its greatest trial. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past compelling, please consider subscribing and joining us as we continue to explore this pivotal era in American history. We have so much more to uncover together.
Welcome back to our series where we dive deep into the lives of figures who shaped history. Today, we turn our attention to one of the most iconic leaders in American history, Abraham Lincoln. But we're not just looking at the legend carved in stone. We're exploring the man behind the monument, the burdened president who shouldered a nation's fate. Imagine this, a lanky, self-taught lawyer from the frontier, a man who faced numerous political defeats and personal tragedies. His path to the presidency was anything but easy. He lost Senate races, endured ridicule, and was seen by many as a dark horse candidate. Yet through sheer perseverance and a powerful moral clarity on the issue of slavery's expansion, he ascended to the highest office in the land in 1860. It was a victory that paradoxically signaled the beginning of the nation's greatest crisis. Before he even took the oath of office, states began to secede, and the shadow of civil war loomed large. This wasn't the presidency Lincoln had envisioned. Instead of building canals and railroads, he was thrust into the role of a wartime commander-in-chief. The next 4 years would be a relentless trial by fire. The Civil War was not some distant conflict. It was a brutal, intimate struggle that tore families and communities apart. Every casualty report, every list of the fallen landed on his desk. Friends and advisors would often find him pacing the halls of the White House late at night, his face etched with worry, his tall frame stooped by an invisible weight. Think about the pressure. He was managing contentious generals, navigating a deeply divided cabinet, and trying to rally a northern public that grew weary of the endless bloodshed and sacrifice. He faced constant criticism from all sides. Some called him a tyrant for suspending habeas corpus. Others lambasted him for not being aggressive enough in prosecuting the war or in ending slavery. His every decision was scrutinized, his every move second-guessed. The weight of hundreds of thousands of lives, the future of the Republic itself, rested squarely on his shoulders. This immense burden aged him visibly. Photographs taken just 4 years apart show a man transformed, his face deeply lined, his eyes holding a profound and weary sadness. But beneath that weary exterior lay a core of unyielding resolve. What drove him was a quiet, almost stubborn determination to achieve one monumental goal: the preservation of the Union. For Lincoln, the United States was more than just a collection of states. It was an experiment in democracy, a beacon of hope for government of the people, by the people, for the people. He believed that if the nation could be torn apart by internal division, it would prove to the world that self-government was a failure. This conviction was his compass, guiding him through the darkest hours of the war. He wasn't a warmonger. In fact, his letters and speeches are filled with a deep sense of melancholy and a longing for peace. He understood the human cost of the conflict better than anyone. Yet, he refused to compromise on the fundamental principle that the Union was perpetual and indivisible. This quiet determination is what allowed him to weather the storm of defeats in the early years of the war, to make the bold and risky decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and to stand for re-election in 1864, when many, including himself, thought he would lose. His leadership style was unique. He used storytelling and humor not just to disarm his opponents, but to process the immense stress he was under. He would listen patiently to all sides of an argument, absorbing every detail before retreating into his own thoughts to make a final, lonely decision. He was a master of language, crafting speeches like the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address that soared above the bitter politics. of the day, reframing the war's purpose and calling for a future built on reconciliation and healing with malice toward none, with charity for all. In the end, Lincoln's burden was also his legacy. His unwavering commitment saved the Union and, in doing so, led to the abolition of slavery, fundamentally reshaping the nation's destiny. He paid the ultimate price for his dedication, but his vision for a united and more just America endured. The story of Abraham Lincoln is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the absence of burdens, but about the courage to carry them for a cause greater than oneself. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the life of the burdened president. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating characters. We'll see you next time.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. In this chapter, we arrive at the conflict's dramatic and consequential conclusion. The year is 1865, and after 4 long, brutal years of fighting, the Confederacy is on the brink of collapse. The war that had torn the nation apart was finally drawing to a close, but its end would be just as complex and tumultuous as its beginning. Let's set the scene. By early 1865, the Confederate war effort was crumbling. General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea had devastated Georgia, cutting a path of destruction that crippled the South's infrastructure and morale. His forces then turned north, marching through the Carolinas, continuing to apply relentless pressure. Meanwhile, in Virginia, General Ulysses S. Grant had been locked in a grueling siege against General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Petersburg and Richmond for nearly 10 months. The Confederate lines were stretched thin, supplies were dangerously low, and desertions were rampant. The men were starving, exhausted, and they knew the end was near. The final act began on April 1st, 1865, at the Battle of Five Forks. This Union victory was decisive. It shattered Lee's right flank and forced him to abandon the long-defended trenches around Petersburg. The very next day, on April 2nd, the Confederate government, including President Jefferson Davis, evacuated their capital, Richmond. As they fled, they set fire to military supplies, and the flames quickly spread, engulfing much of the city in a devastating inferno. When Union troops entered Richmond on April 3rd, they found a city in ruins, a symbolic and powerful image of the Confederacy's downfall. With Richmond fallen, Lee's army was in a desperate retreat westward. His goal was to link up with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in North Carolina, but Grant's army was in hot pursuit, relentlessly cutting off his escape routes. These men were a shadow of their former selves, hungry and exhausted, their numbers dwindling with every mile. The chase was relentless. Small but fierce battles erupted as the Union cavalry picked off stragglers and blocked roads. The final, decisive engagement happened at Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9, 1865, Lee realized his position was hopeless. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and had no realistic chance of breaking through the Union lines. He sent a note to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. The two generals, who had been adversaries for so long, finally met in the parlor of a private home owned by Wilmer McLean. It's a fascinating historical irony that the war, which arguably began on McLean's property at the First Battle of Bull Run, also ended in his new home, miles away. The terms of surrender offered by Grant were surprisingly generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms, and any man who owned a horse or mule could take it home to help with the spring planting. Grant also ordered that rations be provided to Lee's starving army. This act of compassion was a deliberate move by President Lincoln, who had instructed Grant to let him up easy. Lincoln's focus was already on reconciliation and rebuilding the nation, not on punishing the defeated South. Lee accepted the terms, and the surrender was signed. The Army of Northern Virginia, the most formidable fighting force of the Confederacy, had ceased to exist. But how did this momentous news spread across the country? In 1865, there was no internet, no radio, no television. The primary means of long-distance communication was the telegraph. As soon as the surrender was confirmed, telegraph operators began tapping out the message. Lee has surrendered. The news flashed across the wires, reaching major cities in the north within hours. From the telegraph offices, the information spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed extra editions, with bold, screaming headlines announcing the war's end. Boys, known as newsies, ran through the streets shouting the headlines, their voices carrying the news to every corner of the city. People poured out of their homes and workplaces, gathering in public squares, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. In Washington, D.C., the celebration was electric. Crowds gathered outside the White House, cheering for President Lincoln. Cannons were fired and saluted. Church bells across the north, which had so often tolled for funerals, now rang out in joyous celebration. Strangers embraced in the streets. Parades, both spontaneous and organized, marched through cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The relief was palpable. After 4 years of constant anxiety, of waiting for news from the front, of reading endless casualty lists, it was finally over. The sacrifice had been immense, but it seemed, at last, that it had not been in vain. The Union was preserved. The reactions were deeply personal. For families who had sons, brothers, or fathers in the army, the news meant their loved ones might finally be coming home. The constant fear that had been a part of their daily lives for years suddenly lifted. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated joy of knowing that the person you love has survived. Letters from soldiers began to arrive, filled with their own accounts of the surrender and their hopes for returning to a life of peace. However, the surrender at Appomattox didn't mean the war was completely over. While Lee's army was the largest and most significant, other Confederate forces were still in the field. General Johnston's army in North Carolina didn't surrender to Sherman until April 26th. Other, more remote Confederate commands held out even longer. The last major Confederate force, under General Edmund Kirby Smith, surrendered in the Trans-Mississippi Department on June 2nd. The final surrender of a Confederate vessel, the CSS Shelby, didn't happen until November 6, 1865, in Liverpool, England, as its crew had not heard the war was over. So, while the joy in the North was immense, it was tempered by a sense of profound loss and a great deal of uncertainty about the future. The war had cost the nation over 620,000 lives, more than any other conflict in American history. Nearly every family, North and South, had been touched by loss. The physical devastation in the South was almost total. Cities were in ruins, farms were destroyed, and the economy had completely collapsed. The institution of slavery, the root cause of the war, had been abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment. But what would that mean for the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans? What would their status be? How would they be integrated into society? These were the immense questions that now faced the nation. The sense of relief was real, but it was mixed with a heavy dose of apprehension. The task of binding up the nation's wounds, as Lincoln had so eloquently put it in his second inaugural address, was just beginning. The period that followed, known as Reconstruction, would be one of the most challenging and contentious in American history. The fight to define freedom and citizenship, and to rebuild a shattered country, would prove to be, in many ways, as difficult as the war itself. And then, just as the nation was beginning to celebrate the peace, tragedy struck. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The man who had steered the Union through its darkest hour was gone. The news of his death sent a shockwave of grief and horror across the North. The jubilant celebrations turned into widespread mourning. The future, which had seemed so hopeful just days before, was now plunged back into uncertainty. Lincoln's vision of a merciful and swift reconstruction was now in jeopardy, and the nation was left to navigate the difficult path forward without its most capable leader. The end of the Civil War, therefore, was not a simple, happy conclusion. It was a complex moment of profound relief, mixed with overwhelming grief, a sense of victory shadowed by the immense challenges of rebuilding a broken nation. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one that would shape the course of American society for generations to come. The questions raised in the ashes of the war are questions we still grapple with today. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of the Civil War is a powerful reminder of our nation's struggles and its capacity for both great conflict and great healing. If you found this interesting, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. In this chapter, we arrive at one of the most pivotal and emotionally charged moments in American history: the surrender of General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the symbolic end of a 4-year conflict that had torn the nation apart, pitted brother against brother, and claimed over 600,000 lives. By early April 1865, the situation for the Confederacy was desperate. The Confederate capital, Richmond, had fallen. Lee's once mighty army, now numbering fewer than 30,000 men, was exhausted, starving, and relentlessly pursued by Union forces under the command of Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. 4 days, Lee had tried to outmaneuver Grant, hoping to reach a supply train at Appomattox Station and then turn south to link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. But it was a race against time, and time was running out. On the morning of April 9th, Lee made one final, desperate attempt to break through the Union lines. His men, led by Major General John B. Gordon, launched an attack, hoping to clear a path. Initially, they pushed back the Union cavalry, but their brief success was short-lived. As the morning mist cleared, they saw a horrifying sight: massive formations of Union infantry, armed and ready, blocking their path. The escape route was closed. The fight was over. Upon receiving the report, General Lee knew the inevitable had come. He famously remarked, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Dressed in his finest uniform, as if for a grand occasion rather than a surrender, Lee rode his horse, Traveler, to meet his Union counterpart. The meeting took place in the front parlor of a modest brick home owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. In a strange twist of fate, McLean had moved to Appomattox to escape the war after his previous home near Manassas was damaged during the First Battle of Bull Run. The war, it seemed, had followed him. Imagine the scene in that small room. On one side, the dignified, immaculately dressed Robert E. Lee, the embodiment of the Southern aristocracy and a military genius. On the other, Ulysses S. Grant, in a mud-spattered private's uniform with only his general's stars to indicate his rank. Grant, known for his grit and determination, was initially somber, remembering their time together in the Mexican-American War. He felt no joy in Lee's defeat, only a sense of profound sadness at the tragedy that had brought them to this point. They exchanged polite small talk for a few moments before Lee, ever the professional, brought the conversation to the purpose of their meeting. Grant then laid out the terms of surrender. And here we see the first glimmer of the reconciliation that President Lincoln so desperately wanted. The terms were astonishingly generous. These officers and men were to be paroled and sent home. They would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason. They had to turn over their rifles and artillery, but Grant made a crucial concession. He allowed the men, including the officers, to keep their personal side, and more importantly, their horses and mules. Grant understood that these men were not just soldiers. They were farmers. Their animals were not tools of war, but essential for planting crops and rebuilding their lives when they returned home. Lee was visibly moved by this gesture. "I told Grant this will have a very happy effect upon my army." When the formal surrender documents were being drafted, Lee mentioned his men were starving. Grant immediately ordered that 25,000 rations be sent to the Confederate camp. The war was over, and the healing was beginning. As Lee rode back to his men, a wave of emotion swept through the Confederate camp. Soldiers crowded around him, reaching out to touch him, to touch his horse, tears streaming down their faces. They knew what his return meant. In a brief, choked farewell address, he acknowledged their unsurpassed courage and fortitude and took full responsibility for the decision to surrender, sparing his men the burden of that choice. For the Union soldiers, the news was met with wild celebration. Cannons began to fire and salute, but Grant quickly put a stop to it. "The war is over," he told his officers. "The rebels are our countrymen again." He forbade any overt celebration. understanding that gloating would only deepen the wounds of a defeated foe. This act of respect set the tone for the formal surrender ceremony a few days later. On April 12th, the Confederate infantry marched to a designated spot to stack their arms and lay down their battle flags. They were met not by jeers or insults, but by a line of Union soldiers standing at attention, a silent salute of honor from one brave army to another. Major General Joshua Chamberlain, the Union hero of Gettysburg, ordered the salute. As the Confederates marched past, he wrote, "On our part, not a sound of trumpet, but an odd stillness rather, and breath-holding, as if it were the passing of the dead." In response, the Confederate General Gordon, leading his men, dipped his sword in a gesture of mutual respect. It was a soldier's peace. For civilians back home, both North and South, the news from Appomattox brought a complex mix of emotions. In the North, there was overwhelming relief and joy. The war was finally over. Families could be reunited. The nation, though battered and bruised, was preserved. Celebrations erupted in cities and towns across the Union. In the South, the news was met with devastation, shock, and a profound sense of loss. Their cause was lost. Their world was turned upside down. For 4 years, they had sacrificed everything. Now, they faced an uncertain future, their economy in ruins, their social structure dismantled. The surrender was not just a military defeat. It was the end of a way of life. Yet, mixed with the grief was also a quiet sense of relief for many. The killing had stopped. Their sons and husbands could finally come home. President Lincoln, back in Washington, embodied the spirit of magnanimous peace that Grant had shown at He had long argued for a malice toward none, with charity for all approach to Reconstruction. He did not want to punish the South. He wanted to welcome them back into the Union as quickly and painlessly as possible. He believed a generous peace was the only way to truly heal the nation's wounds and build a lasting, just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln saw Lee's surrender not as a victory over an enemy, but as a first step in reuniting a family. Tragically, Lincoln would not live to see his vision of a gentle Reconstruction fulfilled. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14th, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. His death was a catastrophe for the nation, and especially for the South. Without Lincoln's moderating influence, the path to Reconstruction would be far more difficult and contentious than he had envisioned. While Appomattox was the end of the largest Confederate army, it wasn't the absolute end of the war. Other Confederate forces remained in the field, and it would take several more months for all of them to surrender. But the surrender of Robert E. Lee, the most revered military figure in the Confederacy, signaled that the cause was truly lost. His actions set a powerful precedent, encouraging other commanders to lay down their arms rather than continuing a bloody and futile guerrilla war. The moment at Appomattox, in that small parlor, was more than just a military transaction. It was a profound human drama that captured the exhaustion, the sorrow, and the faintest glimmer of hope for a reunited nation. It was a testament to the character of two great generals, Lee and Grant, who chose honor and pragmatism over continued bloodshed. It was the beginning of a long, painful, and still incomplete journey to bind up the nation's wounds and redefine what it meant to be an American. The legacy of that day continues to shape the United States, reminding us of the immense cost of division and the profound importance of a generous and forgiving peace. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this chapter on the surrender at Appomattox enlightening. It's a moment filled with lessons about leadership, dignity, and the difficult process of reconciliation. Please join us next time as we explore the immediate aftermath of the war and the beginning of the turbulent era of Reconstruction. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into American history. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. In this chapter, we dive into one of the most poignant what-ifs in history. Abraham Lincoln's vision for a reunited nation. The cannons had fallen silent. The bloodiest conflict on American soil was over. But the country was shattered, deeply wounded, and facing an uncertain future. How do you mend a broken family? How do you welcome back states that had waged a brutal 4-year war to leave? These were the monumental questions weighing on President Lincoln. Long before the final surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln was already thinking about peace. He wasn't interested in punishment or revenge. His primary goal, the one that guided him through the darkest days of the war, was the preservation of the Union. To him, the southern states had never legally left. They were simply in a state of rebellion. Now that the rebellion was crushed, the task was to bring them back into the national fold, smoothly and swiftly. This wasn't a popular view in some circles. Many in the North, the radical Republicans in Congress especially, felt the South should be treated as conquered territory. They wanted to see the leaders of the Confederacy punished, the old Southern power structure dismantled, and ironclad protections put in place for the newly freed African Americans. They saw Lincoln's approach as far too lenient, too forgiving. But Lincoln's vision was rooted in a profound sense of healing. He believed that a harsh peace would only sow the seeds for future conflict. It would create lasting bitterness and resentment, making true reunification impossible. He wanted to rebuild not just the political structures, but the very spirit of the nation. His first major proposal came in December 1863, with the proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. This plan, often called the 10% Plan, was a model of leniency. It offered a full pardon to most Confederates, excluding high-ranking officials if they took an oath of loyalty to the United States and accepted the abolition of slavery. Once just 10% of a state's 1860 voting population had taken this oath, that state could form a new government and be readmitted to the Union. Think about that for a moment. Only 10%. This was a remarkably low bar, designed to encourage a quick end to the fighting and a rapid restoration of civilian government in the South. Lincoln wasn't demanding that a majority of Southerners suddenly embrace the Union cause. He was creating a pathway, an incentive for a loyal core to step forward and begin the process of rebuilding. He believed that by making it easy to return, the wounds of war could begin to heal more quickly. This plan immediately put him at odds with Congress. The radical Republicans were horrified. They argued that the 10% Plan would allow the old Southern aristocracy, the very people who had led the rebellion, to quickly regain power. What was to stop them from simply recreating the old system, just without the official title of slavery? They feared that the newly freed slaves would be left unprotected and at the mercy of their former masters. In response, Congress passed its own, much stricter plan in 1864, the Wade-Davis Bill. This bill required that 50% of a state's white male citizens take an ironclad oath of past and future loyalty to the Union. It also demanded that new state constitutions formally abolish slavery and disenfranchise Confederate leaders. Lincoln found this bill too punitive. He believed it would bog down the process of Reconstruction and make it impossible to establish new, loyal governments in a timely manner. So, in a move that further angered Congress, he used a pocket veto to kill the bill, simply refusing to sign it before Congress adjourned. The clash between Lincoln's executive approach and Congress's legislative demands highlighted the central conflict of Reconstruction. Who was in charge of rebuilding the nation, the President or the Congress? And what was the primary goal? Quick reconciliation or a fundamental restructuring of Southern society? Lincoln firmly believed in the former. He saw Reconstruction as a presidential power, a way to use his authority as commander-in-chief to bring the war to its final, peaceful conclusion. But perhaps nothing captures the essence of Lincoln's vision more powerfully than his own words. As the war drew to a close and his second term began, he had the chance to deliver a victory speech, to gloat, to rally the North in triumph. He did the opposite. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4th, 1865, is one of the most remarkable speeches in American history. It's short, more like a sermon than a political address, and it's filled with a deep sense of humility and a call for grace. He didn't blame the South. Instead, he framed the war as a divine punishment upon the whole nation, North and South alike, for the sin of slavery. He acknowledged that both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and that the prayers of both could not be answered. The war, in his view, was a terrible price that the entire country had to pay. And then he delivered the lines that would come to define his legacy and his hope for the future. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations, with malice toward none, with charity for all. These weren't just poetic words. They were his guiding policy. It was a radical call for forgiveness in a time of intense hatred. It was a plea to set aside the desire for retribution and instead focus on the difficult work of healing and rebuilding. Binding up the nation's wounds meant more than just repairing buildings and bridges. It meant mending shattered relationships and creating a shared future. In the final weeks of his life, Lincoln continued to act on this principle. He traveled to the fallen Confederate capital of Richmond, not as a conquering hero, but with a quiet, somber demeanor. He met with Confederate officials, including the Vice President of the Confederacy, to discuss terms for a peaceful surrender and a smooth transition. His focus was always on what came next, on how to make the peace a permanent one. He supported the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency designed to help formerly enslaved people and poor whites in the South by providing food, housing, education, and medical aid. While his 10% plan didn't explicitly detail protections for freedmen, his actions suggest he was evolving, understanding that emancipation was only the first step. True freedom would require support and protection. But this vision of a merciful and rapid reconstruction was never to be realized. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His death was a national catastrophe, but it was an especially profound tragedy for the future of the South and the project of Reconstruction. The one man with the moral authority, political skill, and forgiving spirit to potentially guide the country through this perilous period was gone. With Lincoln's death, the reins of power were handed to his vice president, Andrew Johnson, and the stage was set for a bitter, prolonged, and ultimately failed struggle over the soul of the nation. The malice toward none that Lincoln had so eloquently pleaded for would soon be replaced by political warfare, impeachment, and a deep-seated resentment that would poison race relations for a century to come. Lincoln's plan was not perfect. Historians still debate whether his lenient approach would have adequately protected the rights of African Americans. Would the old power structures have reasserted themselves? Could true equality have been achieved without the more forceful hand of the radical Republicans? These are questions we can never definitively answer. What we do know is that Lincoln's vision was one of unity over division, forgiveness over vengeance, and healing over punishment. He sought to build a just and lasting peace based on the shared belief in a common American destiny. His plan was a gamble, a bet on the better angels of our nature. It was a bet that, tragically, he never got the chance to see through. The path not taken haunts American history, leaving us to wonder what might have been if Lincoln had lived to bind up the nation's wounds. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Join us next time as we explore the tumultuous era of presidential reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. See you then. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 6, we're delving into a period often painted with the broad strokes of peace and reunion. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. We're calling this chapter A Divided Country Beneath the Calm, because while the cannons had fallen silent, the echoes of war reverberated through every corner of the nation. The official end of the conflict had unmagically erased the deep-seated resentments that had been simmering for decades, and were now scorched into the national consciousness. For millions. The war wasn't just a political event. It was a deeply personal catastrophe that had taken fathers, sons, and brothers, and destroyed homes and livelihoods. Imagine walking through a town in the South just after the surrender. The air is thick, not just with the humidity, but with a palpable sense of loss and bitterness. For the former Confederates, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of their entire world. Their social structure, their economic system, their very identity had been dismantled. Many had lost everything: their land, their fortunes, and their sense of purpose. This wasn't a simple case of accepting defeat and moving on. For them, it was a humiliating subjugation. They were now living in a country they felt was no longer their own, governed by the very people they had just fought a brutal war against. This struggle with defeat wasn't just about pride. It was an existential crisis. How do you rebuild a life on the ashes of everything you once believed in? How do you reconcile with an enemy who now holds all the power? These were the questions haunting millions, and the answers were not easy to find. This simmering anger and a profound sense of injustice would become the fertile ground for future conflicts, proving that the end of a war is often just the beginning of a different, more insidious kind of battle. And in this Volatile atmosphere. Radical voices from both sides found a captive audience. These weren't the moderate politicians seeking compromise. These were the hardliners, the ideologues who saw the post-war world in black and white. In the North, radical Republicans in Congress argued that the South needed to be fundamentally remade, not just welcomed back. They pushed for harsh measures, demanding full civil rights and voting rights for newly freed African Americans, and believing that the old Southern aristocracy must be completely stripped of its power to prevent any future rebellion. To them, President Lincoln's and later President Johnson's approach of malice toward none was dangerously naive. They saw it as an invitation for the old guard to regain control and essentially nullify the Union's hard-won victory. They weren't just looking for peace. They were looking for a permanent, transformative justice, and they were willing to use the full force of the federal government to achieve it. Their speeches and editorials were fiery, filled with righteous indignation, and they found a receptive audience among Northerners who felt the South had not yet paid a sufficient price for the bloodshed it had caused. Meanwhile, in the South, an equally radical, though very different, chorus was rising. These were the unrepentant Confederates, the so-called unreconstructed rebels. They refused to accept the legitimacy of the new order. For them, the lost cause was not lost at all. It was a noble crusade that had been temporarily defeated by overwhelming force, not by a superior moral or political argument. They romanticized the antebellum South, portraying it as a chivalrous and honorable society. They saw Reconstruction not as an effort to rebuild, but as a hostile occupation designed to punish and humiliate them. These voices advocated for resistance in any form possible. They worked to undermine federal authority, intimidate black voters and their white allies, and reassert a social hierarchy that placed white Southerners firmly at the top. Through secret societies and political maneuvering, they sought to redeem the South, which meant returning it to its pre-war state of white supremacy, minus the formal institution of slavery. This fierce, defiant narrative was powerful. It gave a sense of purpose and honor to those who felt defeated and stripped of their dignity. It was a rallying cry that united a population desperate to reclaim its identity and control. So you have these two powerful, opposing forces, both fueled by genuine, deeply held beliefs, and both utterly convinced of their own righteousness. The radical Republicans in the North believed they were fighting for the very soul of the Republic, for equality and justice. The unrepentant secessionists in the South believed they were defending their homes, their heritage, and their way of life from a tyrannical conqueror. In the middle were millions of Americans moderates, newly freed slaves, and exhausted soldiers from both sides who simply wanted to rebuild their lives in peace. But the calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface of daily life, the nation was a powder keg. The political debates in Washington were not just abstract arguments. They had life and death consequences for people on the ground. Every new law passed, every election held, every act of defiance or enforcement was another spark in a landscape still littered with the tinder of war. It was a period where the fundamental questions of what it meant to be an American were being fought over, not on the battlefield, but in Congress, in town squares, and in the hearts and minds of the people. This clash of radical ideologies created an environment where true reconciliation was nearly impossible. How could a Unionist who had lost his son at Gettysburg find common ground with a former Confederate who still celebrated the lost cause? How could a newly freed man, finally tasting liberty, trust the very people who had enslaved him and were now working to strip him of his newfound rights? The official policies of Reconstruction, which we'll explore in detail later, were constantly being pulled and twisted by these extreme pressures. Federal troops were stationed in the South to protect the rights of African Americans and maintain order, but their presence was seen by many white Southerners as an infuriating symbol of their defeat and occupation. This created a cycle of resentment and resistance. Efforts to build a new, more inclusive South were met with violent opposition, and that violence, in turn, fueled the determination of radical Republicans in the North to impose even stricter controls. The calm was, in reality, a period of intense, low-grade warfare, fought with legislation, intimidation, and economic coercion instead of muskets and cannons. This era perfectly illustrates how the end of a war doesn't mean the end of conflict. The divisions were deeper than just North versus South. They were divisions between competing visions for the future of America. One vision was of a nation reborn, a true republic dedicated to the principle of equality for all its citizens. The other was a vision of restoration, of returning to an old social order and preserving a regional identity that felt threatened with extinction. These two visions could not coexist peacefully. The struggles of this period laid the groundwork for the next 100 years of American history, from the rise of Jim Crow to the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Understanding this deeply divided post-war landscape is crucial to understanding why the promises of freedom and equality made after the Civil War took so long to be even partially realized. The country was no longer officially at war, but it was far from being at peace. It was a nation struggling to define itself, haunted by the ghosts of its past and deeply uncertain about its future. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is far from over, and the consequences of this fractured peace are something we're still grappling with today. If you found this exploration insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll look at the specific policies of Reconstruction and the intense battles they ignited. Your support helps us continue to dig deep into these crucial moments in history. We'll see you next time. History often gives us names, but rarely the full story behind them. When we hear the name John Wilkes Booth, we immediately think of one of the most infamous acts in American history. But who was the man before that fateful night? To truly understand the tragedy of April 14th, 1865, we have to look beyond the assassin and see the person who pulled the trigger. This is the story of the man behind the name. Long before his name was linked with infamy, John Wilkes Booth was a household name for a very different reason. He was, by all accounts, a superstar. Think of the biggest movie stars of to death at was Booth in the mid-19th century. He was born into an acting dynasty. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a legendary British stage actor who moved to the United States. His older brother, Edwin Booth, was considered the greatest American actor of his generation. And John Wilkes Booth was hot on his heels. He was incredibly handsome, charismatic, and had a magnetic stage presence. He was known for his athletic, daring performances, often doing his own stunts, leaping across the stage in roles like Romeo or Macbeth. Women adored him. Men admired his talent. Newspapers of the day described him as the handsomest man in America. He was earning what would be the equivalent of millions of dollars a year today. He was a 19th century celebrity, in every sense of the word. He had fame, fortune, and the adoration of the public. So, what went wrong? How did this celebrated artist become a reviled assassin? The answer lies in the deep, dark currents of his political passion and a growing sense of frustration that would curdle into fanaticism. While his brother Edwin was famously apolitical, John was anything but. He was a fervent, passionate supporter of the Confederacy and a staunch believer in the institution of slavery. He was born and raised in Maryland, a border state with divided loyalties, but his heart was firmly with the South. He saw the Southern way of life as noble and chivalrous, and he viewed Abraham Lincoln and the Union as tyrannical forces bent on destroying it. He didn't just disagree with the North, he despised it with every fiber of his being. He saw Lincoln not as a president, but as a keen despot who was trampling on the Constitution and states' rights. This political fervor wasn't just a private opinion, it was a core part of his identity. He would get into heated arguments with friends, family, and even strangers over the war. His brother Edwin recalled that John's political rants became so intense that they had to avoid the topic altogether. While the Union celebrated victories, Booth saw only defeats for his beloved cause. He was an outspoken white supremacist, believing that black people were inferior and that slavery was a natural and divinely ordained system. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was, in his eyes, an abomination. As the Civil War raged on, Booth's frustration grew into a dangerous obsession. He wasn't just a Southern sympathizer, he wanted to be a part of the action. But unlike many of his peers who went to fight, Booth stayed on the stage. This might have created a deep internal conflict. He was performing heroic roles every night, but in the real-life drama unfolding across the country, he was merely a spectator. He secretly joined a pro-Confederate underground organization, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and even used his ability to travel freely as an actor to smuggle medical supplies to the South. But this wasn't enough for him. He craved a grander, more dramatic role in the conflict. As the Confederacy's fortunes dwindled, Booth's desperation intensified. He saw the world he believed in crumbling before his very eyes. Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox in early April 1865 was the final blow. For most of the country, it was a moment of relief and the beginning of healing. For John Wilkes Booth, it was a catastrophe. His cause was lost. His heroes were defeated. The world he cherished was gone forever. In his mind, something drastic had to be done. The actor, used to dramatic plots and grand gestures, began to script his own final, terrible act. He had initially plotted to kidnap President Lincoln and hold him for ransom in exchange for Confederate prisoners of war. He and a small group of co-conspirators had even stalked the president, looking for an opportunity. But the surrender changed everything. Kidnapping was no longer enough. The defeat of the South required a more shocking, more permanent response. In the twisted theater of his mind, a new plot was born. It was no longer about ransom. It was about revenge. It was about decapitating the Union government and throwing the North into chaos, hoping it might somehow reignite the Confederate cause. On the morning of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Booth learned that President and Mrs. Lincoln would be attending a play that very evening at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It was a theater where Booth was a star, a place where he knew every corridor, every trapdoor, every secret passage. The stage was set for his final, devastating performance. He believed this act would make him a hero, a savior of the South, immortalized for his daring. He saw himself as a modern-day Brutus, striking down a tyrant to save the Republic. He went to the theater that afternoon to prepare, drilling a small peephole in the door of the presidential box so he could watch his moment arrive. He spent the day finalizing his plans, writing letters to justify his actions, and gathering his nerve. He went to a saloon for a drink, his mind racing with the enormity of what he was about to do. To the outside world, he was still John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor. But inside, he had transformed into something else entirely, an extremist, a fanatic, a man so consumed by his ideology that he was willing to commit an act that would plunge a grieving nation back into darkness. The handsome, charismatic star was about to step onto the world stage for his last and most infamous role, not as a hero in a play, but as an assassin in the pages of history. This descent from a celebrated artist to a reviled killer is a chilling reminder of how charisma and fame can mask a deeply disturbed and dangerous ideology. Booth wasn't a simple villain from a storybook. He was a complex, privileged, and deeply flawed individual whose political fanaticism led him down a path of no return. Understanding the man, his beliefs, and his frustrations doesn't excuse his crime, but it does help us understand the forces that can drive a person to commit the unthinkable. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories behind the names. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 8, we're delving deep into the mind of John Wilkes Booth, exploring the potent mix of anger and ideology that fueled his radicalization. To truly understand the tragic events of April 1865, we must first understand the man and the beliefs that drove him to commit an act that would forever scar the nation. John Wilkes Booth was more than just a famous actor. He was a fervent and unapologetic supporter of the Confederacy. Born and raised in Maryland, a border state with deeply divided loyalties, Booth's sympathies were firmly with the South. He saw the Confederate cause not as a rebellion, but as a righteous fight for independence, a second American Revolution to preserve a way of life he held sacred. This wasn't just a political preference for him. It was a core part of his identity. He romanticized the Southern aristocracy, viewing it as a bastion of honor, chivalry, and tradition, a stark contrast to what he perceived as the grubby, industrial, and morally corrupt North. His letters and diaries from the era are filled with passionate defenses of slavery, which he considered a natural and divinely ordained institution. He dismissed abolitionists as dangerous fanatics, meddling with a system they didn't understand. For Booth, the Southern cause was inextricably linked to the preservation of this social order. He believed the South was fighting to protect its property, its culture, and its constitutional rights from an overreaching federal government. This passionate, almost theatrical devotion was the bedrock upon which his later, more dangerous ideas would be built. He wasn't just a passive sympathizer. He was an active believer, a man who saw the world in black and white, with the Confederacy draped in the gleaming armor of a noble knight. Central to Booth's rage was one man, Abraham Lincoln. In Booth's eyes, Lincoln was not a president, but a tyrant. He saw him as a despot who had usurped power, trampled on the Constitution, and waged a brutal, unjust war against his own people. Every major decision Lincoln made was, to Booth, another nail in the coffin of the American Republic. He viewed the Emancipation Proclamation not as a document of freedom, but as a cynical military tactic designed to incite chaos and destroy the Southern economy. He believed Lincoln was a king in all but name, an autocrat who suspended civil liberties like habeas corpus and imposed his will upon a defiant populace. This wasn't just political disagreement. It was a deep personal hatred. Booth would rant to friends and family about Lincoln's supposed tyranny, his speeches filled with venom and theatrical flair. He referred to the president with contempt, seeing him as the sole architect of the South's suffering. As the war dragged on and the Union's superior resources began to crush the Confederacy, Booth's animosity intensified. He saw the burning of Atlanta and Sherman's march to the sea not as acts of war, but as barbaric atrocities personally sanctioned by Lincoln. The president became the embodiment of everything Booth despised about the North: its power, its industrial might, and its moral self-righteousness. This singular focus on Lincoln as the ultimate villain was a critical step in Booth's radicalization, transforming a political opponent into a personal nemesis who had to be stopped at any cost. So how did this simmering resentment boil over into a deadly resolve? The journey from angry citizen to political assassin was a gradual but steady descent. As the war turned decisively against the Confederacy in 1864, Booth's desperation grew. He wasn't a soldier on the battlefield, but he yearned to strike a decisive blow for the cause he loved. His fame as an actor gave him unique access and mobility, but it also left him on the sidelines of the actual conflict, a position he found increasingly unbearable. He felt a profound sense of guilt and impotence, and this fueled his desire to do something dramatic, something historic. His initial plan wasn't assassination, it was kidnapping. Booth assembled a small group of co-conspirators with a wild scheme to abduct President Lincoln, smuggle him to Richmond, and exchange him for thousands of Confederate prisoners of war. This, he believed, would breathe new life into the struggling Confederacy. The plan was audacious, theatrical, and ultimately a complete failure. They made several attempts, but circumstances and Lincoln's own unpredictable schedule always thwarted them. Each failure only hardened Booth's resolve and pushed him toward a more extreme and irreversible course of action. The turning point came in April 1865. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. For the Union, it was a moment of triumph and relief. For John Wilkes Booth, it was a catastrophe. The cause he had championed was dead. His world had crumbled. The South was defeated, and his hero, the Confederacy, was no more. His desperation turned to black despair. 2 days later, on April 11th, Booth stood in the crowd outside the White House as Lincoln delivered a speech from a balcony. In his speech, Lincoln spoke of Reconstruction and, crucially, suggested that some African Americans, particularly the very intelligent and those who had served as soldiers, should be granted the right to vote. For Booth, this was the final, unforgivable sin. The idea of black suffrage was anathema to him. According to witnesses, Booth turned to his companion and seethed. That means N-word citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make. In that moment, the plot changed. Kidnapping was no longer enough. The war was over. A hostage exchange was pointless. All that was left was vengeance. Vengeance for the South. Vengeance for its defeat. And vengeance against the man he blamed for it all. His anger, stoked by years of ideological fervor and personal hatred, finally crystallized into a clear, deadly purpose. He would not just stop Lincoln. He would martyr himself for the lost cause. He began to see his act not as murder, but as tyrannicide, a noble deed to rid the world of a despot, just as Brutus had slain Caesar. This self-aggrandizing narrative allowed him to justify the unthinkable. He was no longer just an actor playing a role on stage. He would now play the ultimate role on the stage of history, and the final act would be written in blood. And so, the stage was set. The actor, consumed by a toxic brew of political rage, racial animosity, and a desperate need for historical significance, prepared for his final performance. His anger had fully radicalized him, turning a man of words and theatrics into a man of violent action. The path from passionate supporter to cold-blooded killer was complete. Thank you for watching. In our next chapter, we will walk through the chilling minute-by-minute account of the assassination itself and the chaos that erupted in its wake. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Hello, history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're stepping back in time to April 1865, into a city breathing a collective sigh of relief. Washington, D.C., after 4 brutal years of civil war, a fragile peace had finally settled over the nation. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse just days earlier, on April 9th. For the residents of the Union capital, this wasn't just news, it was the end of a nightmare. The city, which had lived under the constant threat of attack, which had seen its buildings turned into makeshift hospitals and its streets filled with the wounded, was ready to celebrate. And celebrate it did. Imagine the scene. The air, once thick with tension and the smell of gunpowder, was now filled with the sounds of jubilation. Church bells for so long had tolled for the dead, now rang out in joyous peals. Giggitch sound echoing through every street and alley, people poured out of their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy. Strangers embraced on street corners, their shared relief, a powerful bond. The American flag, a symbol fiercely defended, now seemed to fly from every window, every rooftop, every flagpole. It was a sea of red, white, and blue, a vibrant testament to a preserved Union. The city was electric, pulsating with a new, hopeful energy. The celebrations were not just spontaneous outpourings of emotion. They were grand, organized affairs. On the night of April 10th, a massive crowd oed to the White House, their voices roaring for President Abraham Lincoln. They wanted to see the man who had steered them through the storm. Lincoln, ever the humble servant, appeared at a window. He was a man visibly worn by the burdens of war, his face more deeply lined than it had been for years prior. But on this night, a light of triumph shone in his eyes. He spoke to the crowd, not with soaring rhetoric of victory, but with a gentle call for unity and reconstruction. He asked the band to play Dixie, a song that had become the anthem of the Confederacy. It was a symbolic gesture, a profound statement that the nation was one again, that enemies were now countrymen. This was the spirit of Washington in those early April days, a spirit of forgiveness and a deep yearning for healing. During the day, grand illuminations were planned. Public buildings, from the Capitol to the Treasury, were to be lit up with gaslights and candles, transforming the city into a wonderland of light. It was a spectacle meant to banish the darkness of the preceding years. Fireworks exploded in the night sky, their brilliant colors a stark contrast to the flash of cannon fire that had once been a terrifyingly familiar sight. Parades marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, not with the grim determination of soldiers heading to battle, but with the triumphant swagger of veterans and the joyful steps of citizens. It felt as if the entire city was participating in one enormous festival, a carnival of peace. And then there were the soldiers. The men in blue, the boys who had left their farms and factories to fight for the Union, were starting to come home. The city's train stations were scenes of heart-wrenching reunions. Mothers wept as they held sons they feared they'd never see again. Wives clung to husbands, their touch a confirmation that this was real, that the war was truly over. Children, some of whom barely remembered their fathers, stared up at these sun-beaten men in their worn uniforms. The sight of these returning soldiers was a constant, living reminder of the war's cost and its conclusion. They walked to the streets, some with a noticeable limp, others missing a limb, but all carrying the quiet dignity of survivors. They were heroes, and the city treated them as such. People would stop them, shake their hands, and offer them a drink or a meal. These men were the living embodiment of the Union's victory. Washington itself had been transformed by the war. It had grown from a somewhat sleepy southern town into a bustling, crowded metropolis. The government had swelled, and with it, the population. The streets were a chaotic mix of government clerks, politicians, opportunists, nurses, and now, a flood of celebrating soldiers and civilians. The city's infrastructure was strained, but nobody seemed to mind. The mud on the unpaved streets, the constant noise, it was all part of the vibrant, messy, beautiful tapestry of a capital at peace. There was a sense of boundless optimism, a feeling that anything was possible. The nation had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, more unified. The great, terrible question of slavery had been answered, and a new birth of freedom was at hand. The newspapers of the day captured this ecstatic mood. Headlines screamed victory and peace. Editorials praised Lincoln, Grant, and the Union soldiers. They spoke of a bright future, of a nation reborn. Business was booming. With the end of the war, a new era of industrial expansion and westward migration was on the horizon. The capital was the center of this new universe, the place where the future of the nation would be forged. For a few brief shutting days, Washington was the happiest city in America. It was a city looking forward, its bike turned to shadows of the past. The air was filled with plans for the future, for rebuilding the South, for reuniting the country, for honoring the fallen, and for building a more perfect union. Yet, as we know with the benefit of hindsight, a terrible shadow was looming, completely unseen by the celebrating crowds. This overwhelming joy, this citywide party, was the backdrop for one of the most tragic events in American history. The very man who was the focal point of this celebration, the architect of this hard-won peace, was about to be stolen from the nation. As the city reveled in the light of victory, a conspiracy was finalizing its dark plans in the city's shadows. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and a Confederate sympathizer, was not celebrating. He and his co-conspirators were consumed by bitterness and a desire for revenge. The joyous noise of the city likely only fueled their resentment. It's a chilling thought. While thousands of people were singing and cheering for President Lincoln, a small group was plotting his demise. While the president was speaking of malice toward none and charity for all, they were planning an act of ultimate malice. The city was so caught up in its relief that it was blind to the danger in its midst. The security around the president was surprisingly laxed by today's standards. He was a man of the people and often moved about with minimal protection. He was known to attend the theater, a rare chance for him to relax and escape the immense pressures of his office. On the evening of April 14th, Good Friday, President Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, decided to attend a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. It was meant to be a pleasant, relaxing evening, a brief respite. The news that the President and General Grant would be attending was published in the papers. It was an open invitation. While Grant and his wife ultimately declined, the Lincolns went ahead, joined by a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The mood in the theater was festive, reflecting the mood of the entire city. When the president entered his box, the orchestra played Hail to the Chief, and the audience rose to give him a thunderous standing ovation. He was their hero, their beloved, Fateh Abraham. The laughter and applause that filled Ford's Theater that night were the sounds of a city at peace. A city unaware that its joy was about to be shattered. The carefree atmosphere, the feeling of safety and celebration that had enveloped Washington for 5 days, made the coming tragedy all the more shocking. It was a moment of profound irony. The end of a national war was about to be followed by a devastating personal attack on the man who had won it. The city of Washington, in April 1865, stood on a precipice, celebrating on the edge of an abyss, completely oblivious to the foe that was coming. The lights of the grand illumination would soon be extinguished, replaced by the darkness of a nation's grief. This chapter of celebration was about to come to a sudden, violent, and heartbreaking end. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to Washington in the final days of the Civil War. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly joy can turn to sorrow and how history can pivot on a single moment. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where we will explore the immediate aftermath of that fateful night at Ford's Theater. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome back to our series on the life of Abraham Lincoln. Today, we delve into Chapter 10, Lincoln's final days, a period marked by both profound relief and quiet hope, tragically cut short. This spring of 1865 was a season of unprecedented relief for President Lincoln and the entire nation. After 4 long, brutal years, the Civil War was finally drawing to a close. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The news spread like wildfire, and Washington, D.C. erupted in joyous celebration. The city was a sea of waving flags, jubilant crowds, and the constant roar of cannons firing in salute. For Lincoln, this was the moment he had worked and agonized for. The immense burden that had stooped his shoulders and etched deep lines into his face began to lift. Those who saw him in the days following the surrender described a man transformed. His usual melancholy gave way to a palpable sense of peace and even lightheartedness. He was seen smiling more, his laughter more frequent. He spoke not of vengeance or punishment for the defeated South, but of reconciliation and rebuilding. With malice toward none, with charity for all, his words from his second inaugural address now became the guiding principle for the nation's future. In these final days, Lincoln sought solace and joy in the company of his family. He cherished the moments with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and their youngest son, Tad. After years of constant stress and preoccupation with the war, he was finally able to be a more present husband and father. He and Mary would take carriage rides together, discussing their future plans. One of their dreams was to travel after his presidency, perhaps even to visit Europe or the Holy Land. They imagined a life away from the immense pressures of Washington, a quiet life they both deeply longed for. Tad, his lively and affectionate son, was a constant source of delight for the weary president. Lincoln would often be seen with Tad in his office, the boy's playful antics a welcome distraction from the somber affairs of state. They would read together, tell stories, and Lincoln would indulge his son's youthful energy, finding in it a reflection of the nation's own renewed hope. The bond between them was incredibly strong, a beacon of warmth in a life often marked by personal tragedy and public duty. Beyond his immediate family, Lincoln reconnected with friends and colleagues, his mood noticeably more relaxed and optimistic. He enjoyed attending the theater, finding it a wonderful escape. He would invite friends to join him, sharing stories and jokes with a wit that had been sharpened by years of public speaking and debate. His conversations were filled with plans for the future, not just his own, but the nation's. He was deeply engaged in the complex task of reconstruction, envisioning a swift and compassionate process to bring the southern states back into the Union. He wanted to heal the country as deep wounds and ensure that the sacrifices made by so many would lead to a new birth of freedom. On the evening of April 11th, Lincoln delivered what would be his last public address. Standing at a window of the White House, he spoke to a crowd gathered on the lawn. His speech was not one of triumphalism, but a thoughtful and forward-looking discussion on the challenges of rebuilding. He outlined his support for limited black suffrage, particularly for veterans, and the very intelligent. It was a cautious but significant step, one that signaled his evolving vision for a more inclusive American republic. His focus was on unity, on binding up the nation's wounds and creating a lasting peace. In the audience that night was a man named John Wilkes Booth, an actor and fervent Confederate sympathizer. Hearing Lincoln's words about voting rights for African Americans, Booth was enraged. It was in that moment, historians believe, that his plot to assassinate the president solidified. Despite the lurking dangers, Lincoln's final days were characterized by a sense of hope. He had navigated the country through its darkest hour and brought it to the dawn of a new era. He looked forward to overseeing the first years of peace and then retiring to a simpler life in his home state of Illinois. He spoke of returning to his law practice, of spending his days reading, writing, and enjoying the company of old friends. He believed the worst was over and that a brighter future awaited both him and the nation he had saved. On April 14th, Good Friday, Lincoln began his day in a cheerful mood. He held a cabinet meeting where he spoke at length about his lenient plans for Reconstruction, urging his advisors to act with generosity toward the former Confederate states. General Grant, who was in attendance, later remarked that he had never seen the president so happy. Lincoln recounted a recurring dream he had about a mysterious ship moving swiftly toward a distant shore, interpreting it as a good omen, a sign of positive news to come. That evening, President and Mrs. Lincoln, accompanied by a young officer named Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, went to Ford's Theater to see a popular comedy, Our American Cousin. Lincoln was looking forward to a relaxing evening. As the play unfolded, the audience laughed and enjoyed the show, unaware of the tragedy that was about to strike. During the third act, John Wilkes Booth slipped unnoticed into the presidential box. He knew the play well and timed his attack to coincide with a line that would provoke a loud burst of laughter from the audience, masking the sound of his pistol shot. He fired a single bullet into the back of the president's head. Major Rathbone tried to intervene but was severely wounded by Booth, who then leaped from the box onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always two tyrants. The theater descended into chaos. Lincoln slumped forward in his chair, mortally wounded. He was carefully carried across the street to a boarding house, the Peterson House, and laid on a bed that was too small for his tall frame. Doctors, cabinet members, and friends gathered around, their hopes fading as the night wore on. Mary Lincoln was inconsolable, her earlier joys shattered into a million pieces. Throughout the long night, the president never regained consciousness. At 7:22, on the morning of April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had kept a vigil by his bedside, famously remarked, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of Lincoln's assassination sent a shockwave of grief across the nation and the world. The man who had preached reconciliation and charity had been struck down by an act of hateful violence. The joyous celebrations of just a few days earlier were replaced by profound mourning. The hope for a swift and gentle healing of the nation's wounds was suddenly cast into doubt. Lincoln's final days, filled with so much relief and optimism, serve as a poignant and tragic final chapter to his extraordinary life. He had achieved his great goal, the preservation of the Union, and was looking forward to the fruits of that victory. A lasting peace and a reunited country. He was able to experience the joy of that success, to feel the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, and to dream of a future filled with peace and personal happiness. Though his life was cut short, his vision endured. His legacy is not just one of a wartime president, but of a leader who, even in his final moments, was focused on healing, forgiveness, and the fundamental ideals of liberty and justice for all. His hopes for the future became the foundation upon which the nation would have to rebuild, a testament to his enduring belief in the better angels of our nature. Thank you for joining us for this look at Lincoln's final days. His story is a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace and the enduring cost of freedom. Be sure to subscribe and follow our channel for more deep dives into pivotal moments in history. Thanks for watching. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 11, a pivotal moment that seems almost mundane on the surface but is filled with underlying tension and historical weight. We're talking about a simple invitation to the theater, an evening that was supposed to be a moment of lighthearted entertainment but would ultimately become one of the most infamous nights in American history. It was April 14th, 1865. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with celebration. Just 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the long and brutal Civil War. The city was ecstatic. People were dancing in the streets, fireworks lit up the night sky, and a profound sense of relief washed over the nation. The war was over. The Union was preserved. For President Abraham Lincoln, this was the culmination of 4 years of unimaginable stress and sorrow. He had steered the country through its darkest hour, and now he could finally see the dawn of a new era of peace and reconstruction. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically. The immense burden he had carried was visible in the deep lines on his face and the weariness in his eyes. On this particular day, a Friday, Lincoln started his morning as he usually did, with meetings and paperwork. He met with his cabinet, discussing the monumental task of reuniting the nation. The mood was optimistic, forward-looking. They talked about policies for the southern states, the rights of newly freed African Americans, and the path to healing the deep wounds of the war. Lincoln's approach was one of reconciliation and mercy, famously summarized in his second inaugural address with the words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." As the day progressed, the topic of the evening's plans came up. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln had arranged for them to attend a play at Ford's Theater. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular British comedy. It was a chance to escape the pressures of the White House, to relax, and to be seen by the public in a moment of shared celebration. The newspapers had already announced that the President and General Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the Union Army, would be in attendance. The theater was sure to be packed with a jubilant crowd eager to see their leaders. Mary was particularly looking forward to the outing. The war years had been incredibly difficult for her, marked by personal loss and public criticism. An evening of laughter and normalcy was just what she felt they both needed. She saw it as a symbol of their return to a more peaceful life, a life that had been on hold for far too long. However, the idea of going to a public place like a theater wasn't without its concerns. Security for the president was, by modern standards, shockingly lax. While Lincoln did have a guard, the concept of a dedicated, full-time protective detail like the Secret Service we know today didn't exist in the same way. The president often walked around Washington with minimal protection, and his security was more of a loose arrangement than a fortified system. Throughout the war, Lincoln had received countless threats on his life. He kept a thick file in his desk labeled Assassination, filled with angry and threatening letters. He was well aware of the dangers he faced. Many people despised him and his policies, and the end of the war didn't erase that hatred overnight. In fact, for some, the defeat of the Confederacy only deepened their resentment. His primary bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, was deeply concerned about the president's safety. Lamon was a close friend of Lincoln's, a physically imposing man who took his duty to protect the president personally. He had repeatedly warned Lincoln about the risks of appearing in public, especially at night. Lamon had a premonition, a nagging feeling that something terrible was going to happen. Just a few days before, he had begged Lincoln not to go out in public unless Lamon was by his side. But on this particular day, Lamon was out of town, sent on a mission to Richmond by the president himself. Before leaving, he had once again pleaded with Lincoln to be careful. Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, often dismissed these concerns with a touch of fatalism. He once told a friend, "If someone wants to get at me, there is nothing I can do to prevent it. If it is to be, then it is to be." He believed that living in constant fear was no way to live, and he couldn't let the threat of assassination imprison him in the White House. He felt a duty to be accessible to the people. As the afternoon wore on, the plans for the theater outing began to shift. General Grant and his wife, Julia, decided to decline the invitation. They had plans to travel to New Jersey to visit their children. Julia Grant, in particular, was not fond of Mary Lincoln's company and was eager to avoid the social engagement. So, the star guest, the celebrated general, would not be there. This left the Lincolns looking for other companions. They extended an invitation to several people, including Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton, a man known for his cautious and sometimes paranoid nature, strongly advised the president not to go. He thought it was reckless for Lincoln to expose himself in such a public setting, especially with the city still in a state of chaotic celebration. He flatly refused the invitation and urged Lincoln to reconsider. But Lincoln was determined to go. He seemed to have a mix of motivations. Part of it was a promise to his wife, who had her heart set on the evening. Another part was a desire to fulfill the public's expectation. The newspapers had advertised his presence, and he didn't want to disappoint the people who had come to see him. And perhaps, on a deeper level, he simply needed a break. After 4 years of war, a few hours of lighthearted comedy felt like a well-deserved respite. He even joked about the security concerns. When a cabinet member expressed his worries, Lincoln reportedly brushed it off, saying something to the effect of, "Stanton is very anxious, but I don't see any reason to be. I am looking forward to the play." With the grandson available, the Lincolns invited a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They were the daughter and stepson of a prominent senator, and they happily accepted the invitation to join the presidential party. The plan was set. They would have a quiet dinner and then head to Ford's Theater. As evening approached, Lincoln took a final carriage ride with Mary. It was a calm, pleasant evening. They talked about their future, about the years ahead after his presidency was over. He seemed unusually cheerful and optimistic. Almost serene. He spoke of traveling, perhaps even to Jerusalem or California. He expressed a hope that they could find some happiness and peace together, leaving the sorrows of the past behind. Mary would later recall this conversation as one of the most hopeful and tender they had shared in a long time. It was as if the weight of the world was finally lifting from his shoulders. After their carriage ride, they returned to the White House, met Major Rathbone and Miss Harris, and prepared to leave for the theater. Lincoln was assigned a single police officer as his guard for the evening, a man named John Frederick Parker. Parker's record was less than stellar, but he was the one on duty. The atmosphere was one of anticipation for a quiet, enjoyable evening. No one in the presidential party could have imagined the horror that awaited them. They were heading to a comedy, expecting to laugh and relax. They were going to a public celebration, a symbol of the nation's hard-won peace. For Lincoln, it was a moment to finally exhale, to step away from the crushing responsibility of his office and just be a man enjoying a night out with his wife and friends. This decision to go, made against the advice of his closest advisors, and in spite of his own awareness of the dangers, is a poignant element of the story. It highlights his character, his trust in the public, his sense of duty, and perhaps a touch of weariness that made him dismiss the threats against him. He was not a man to be ruled by fear. And so, the presidential carriage clattered through the streets of Washington, making its way to Ford's Theater on 10th Street. Inside, a packed house awaited their arrival, ready to cheer their beloved president. The stage was set, the actors were ready, and a quiet evening of entertainment was about to begin. But lurking in the shadows, another plan was also in motion. A plan born of hatred and desperation that would turn this night of celebration into a national tragedy. This simple act of attending a play, a seemingly trivial decision in the life of a president, was the final piece falling into place, setting the stage for the dramatic and heartbreaking conclusion of Abraham Lincoln's story. Thank you for joining me for this chapter. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly history can turn on the smallest of decisions. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode, where we will witness the events that unfolded inside Ford's Theater on that fateful night. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. Tonight, we step into a place frozen in time, a place of both celebration and tragedy. Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The date is April 14th, 1865. Just 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee surrendered, and the Civil War, which had torn the nation apart for 4 long years, was finally over. The air in Washington is electric, filled with relief, joy, and a profound sense of hope for the future. It's a Good Friday, but the mood is anything but somber. Victory parades filled the streets, buildings are draped in patriotic bunting, and fireworks light up the night sky. The city is alive with celebration, and at the heart of it all stands Ford's Theater, a grand brick building on 10th Street. It's one of the newest and most elegant venues in the capital. Imagine it. A 3-story structure, its facade adorned with arched windows and gas lamps that cast a warm, inviting glow onto the bustling street. As you step inside, you leave the noise of the city behind and enter a world of refined luxury. The lobby is handsomely decorated, but the real spectacle is the auditorium itself. It's a vast, U-shaped space that can hold more than 1,700 people. Rich, red wallpaper with a delicate floral pattern covers the walls. The seats are plush velvet, also in a deep crimson. A massive, glittering gaslit chandelier hangs from the center of the ceiling, its crystal pendants refracting the light and scattering it like 1,000 tiny stars across the room. The theater is arranged in 3 tiers. On the ground floor is the orchestra and the parquet. Above that, the dress circle, considered the best seats in the house. And higher still, the family circle or gallery. But the most prestigious seats are the private boxers that flank the stage. Tonight, the state box, located to the right of the stage, has been specially prepared. It's actually 2 boxers combined into one, decorated with laced curtains, framed mirrors, and comfortable, upholstered chairs. A portrait of George Washington hangs at the center pillar, draped with the American flag, a Treasury Guard flag adding to the patriotic display. This is where the night's most honored guest will be seated. Outside, the excitement is palpable. Carriages clatter over the cobblestone streets, delivering elegantly dressed men and women. The anticipation is tangible as people stream toward the entrance. They are not just here to see a play. They are here to be part of a historic moment, to celebrate the end of the war, and perhaps to catch a glimpse of the man who led them through it. President Abraham Lincoln. His attendance was announced in the newspapers that very afternoon, turning what would have been a normal night at the theater into a major event. Inside, the theater fills rapidly. The murmur of hundreds of conversations creates a low, happy hum. You can hear the rustle of silk gowns, the soft thud of programs being opened, and the occasional burst of laughter. People are greeting friends, discussing the end of the war, and eagerly scanning their programs. The play for the evening is Our American Cousin, a popular British comedy. It's a light, farcical play, perfect for a city in the mood for laughter and celebration. The audience is a cross-section of Washington society. Government officials, military officers in their dress uniforms, wealthy merchants with their families, and ordinary citizens, all brought together by a shared sense of victory and relief. As showtime approaches, the orchestra in the pit below the stage begins to play. The cheerful, upbeat melodies drift through the auditorium, adding to the festive atmosphere. Ushers in smart uniforms guide latecomers to their seats, their lanterns creating moving pools of light in the dimming hall. People settle in, their faces turned toward the stage in anticipation. The air is warm, perfumed with a mixture of cologne, flowers, and the faint, distinct smell of gas from the thousands of jets illuminating the theater. It's a cocoon of warmth and light, a world away from the battlefields and hardships of the past 4 years. Then, a ripple of excitement spreads through the crowd. All heads turn towards the state box. President Abraham Lincoln, his wife Mary Todd Lincoln, and their guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, have arrived. The audience rises to its feet as one, erupting in a wave of thunderous applause and cheers. The orchestra strikes up Hail to the Chief, the powerful, patriotic anthem filling every corner of the Grand Theater. The president, tall and unmistakable, even from a distance, smiles and bows, acknowledging the crowd's adoring reception. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The leader who saved the Union is here, among his people, to share in their joy. He looks weary from the immense strain of the war, but tonight, there is a visible lightness to him. He settles into a rocking chair that was brought in especially for his comfort. Once the presidential party is seated and the applause subsides, the house lights begin to dim. The great chandelier's gas jets are slowly turned down, casting the audience into a soft twilight. A hush falls over the 1,700 people. The only light now comes from the stage, where the footlights create a warm, golden glow. The heavy, ornate curtain, painted with a beautiful scene, begins to rise, slowly revealing the set of a drawing room. The play, Our American Cousin, is about to begin. The actors take their places. The first lines are spoken, and a wave of laughter soon ripples through the audience. For a brief, shining moment, all is right with the world. In the warmth of Ford's Theater, under the glow of the gaslights, a nation exhausted by war allows itself to simply be entertained, to laugh, and to dream of the peaceful future that lies ahead, unaware of the tragedy that is about to unfold. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. If you'd like to continue this journey through history, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome, bike history lovers, to our deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in American history. Today, we've reached a critical turning point. Chapter 13, where John Wilkes Booth takes center stage, not as an actor, but as the central figure in a national tragedy. To everyone else at Ford's Theater on that fateful evening of April 14th, 1865, the building was just a venue, a place for entertainment. But for Booth, it was home. He was one of the most famous actors of his time, and Ford's Theater was his domain. He knew its every secret, every nook and cranny, from the front entrance to the backstage labyrinth. He had performed on that very stage countless times. The scent of sawdust and gaslight, the murmur of the crowd, the creak of the floorboards, these were all as familiar to him as his own reflection. This wasn't just a place he was visiting. It was a place he commanded. His familiarity gave him an almost invisible cloak. No one questioned his presence. When he strolled into the theater that evening, he wasn't a suspicious stranger. He was a celebrity. The staff, the other actors, the stagehands, they all knew him. They would have greeted him with a nod, a smile, perhaps even a bit of awe. "Good evening, Mr. Booth," they would have said. His access was absolute. He could wander wherever he pleased, and no one would bat an eye. This supreme confidence was his most dangerous weapon. He didn't need to sneak or disguise himself. He simply walked in, a wolf in plain sight, hidden by his own fame. Earlier in the day, Booth had visited the theater to collect his mail, a common practice for actors. But this visit was different. He used the opportunity to prepare his trap. He went to the presidential box, the very one President Lincoln would occupy that night. He observed the layout and, most importantly, he tampered with the door. He carved a small peephole into it, allowing him to see inside without being seen. He also prepared a wooden bar, a brace that he could use to jam the door shut from the inside, preventing anyone from following him once his deed was done. Every move was calculated, leveraging his intimate knowledge of the theater to his deadly advantage. He was choreographing his own dark play. As evening fell, Booth's preparations continued. He wasn't just an assassin. He was a man preparing for a performance, albeit a monstrous one. He went to a nearby stable and arranged for his getaway horse. He met with his co-conspirators, giving them their final instructions for the coordinated attacks that were meant to decapitate the Union government. He drank at a saloon next to the theater, steadying his nerves, his mind a whirlwind of fanaticism and theatrical grandeur. He saw himself as a hero, a Brutus for the Southern cause, striking down a tyrant. The play, Our American Cousin, was a comedy, and the theater was filled with laughter. By the third act, the audience was roaring. This was the moment Booth had been waiting for. The sound of a particularly loud laugh line would be the perfect cover for the sound of his pistol shot. He made his way from the saloon, through the theater's lobby, and up the stairs toward the presidential box. He moved with a chilling calmness, the confidence of a man who knew he belonged there. He passed by theater employees, patrons, even the president's own guest, and no one stopped him. He was just John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor, heading backstage. He reached the vestibule outside the presidential box. He could hear the play, the actors' voices, the audience's reactions. He peered through the peephole he had carved earlier. He saw the back of President Lincoln's head, completely vulnerable. The moment was surreal. Time seemed to slow down. Inside the box, Abraham Lincoln was enjoying a rare night of relaxation with his wife, Mary. He was leaning forward, trying to get a better look at the stage. The war was over, and for the first time in 4 long years, a sense of peace seemed possible. For Booth, this was his cue. This was the climax of his own twisted drama. He waited for the specific line in the play he had memorized, the one that always drew the biggest laugh. He held a single-shot Derringia, pistol in one hand and a dagger in the other. He took a deep breath. The years of stage training, the ability to command a moment, all came to a head. He was no longer just an actor, playing a role. He was about to step into history. The final moments ticked away. The laughter from the audience began to build, and with a sense of grim determination, Booth quietly opened the door to the presidential box. The world was about to change forever. What happened in those next few seconds is the subject of our next chapter. We will dissect the act itself, the immediate chaos that erupted inside Ford's Theater, and Booth's dramatic and infamous escape. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a dark but crucial chapter of history. If you're finding this series insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next episode.
Welcome back to our series. Today, we delve into a moment that irrevocably altered the course of American history. A single act of violence that sent shockwaves across a nation still reeling from the wounds of a brutal civil war. We are talking about the night of April 14th, 1865, a date etched into the collective memory, not for celebration, but for tragedy. Just 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the 4-year conflict that had torn the country apart. A sense of weary relief had begun to settle over the capital. Washington, D.C., the air was filled with the promise of peace and reconstruction. President Abraham Lincoln, the steady hand that had guided the Union through its darkest hours, was looking forward to the immense task of reuniting the nation. He believed in a peace of reconciliation, not retribution. On that fateful evening, a Good Friday, the President and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln sought a rare moment of public relaxation. They decided to attend a performance of the popular comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theatre. They were joined in the presidential box by a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The mood in the theatre was jubilant. The presence of the president, a visible symbol of the Union's victory, added to the celebratory atmosphere. The audience was there to laugh, to escape, to feel a sense of normalcy returning after years of conflict. The play progressed, and the audience was engrossed in the onstage antics. Sometime after 10 o'clock, during the third act, a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth approached the presidential box. Booth was a handsome and charismatic figure, a familiar face at Ford's Theatre, so his presence in the private hallway leading to the box would not have immediately raised alarm. He was a fervent Confederate sympathizer, consumed by a bitter hatred for Lincoln, whom he blamed for the South's defeat. He had been part of a larger conspiracy to cripple the Union government. But as other parts of the plot failed, his own mission became a singular, desperate act of vengeance. He timed his entry perfectly. Knowing the play by heart, he waited for a line that was guaranteed to provoke a huge laugh from the audience, a moment when the theatre would be at its loudest. As the actor on stage delivered the comedic line and the theatre erupted in laughter, Booth slipped silently into the presidential box. The sound masked his entry. He raised a single-shot Derringer pistol, aimed it at the back of the president's head, and fired. The sound of the shot was muffled by the audience's laughter. For a brief, surreal moment, almost no one understood what had happened. It was a pop, a strange noise, perhaps part of the play, a firecracker, or a dropped object. There was no immediate scream, no instant panic. The action on stage continued for a split second in the presidential box. However, the scene was one of instant chaos. Major Rathbone, turning to see the smoke and the figure of Booth, immediately lunged at him. Booth, a theatrical man to the core, dropped the pistol and drew a large dagger. He slashed at Rathbone, inflicting a deep wound on his arm. Then, in a move of dramatic flair, Booth vaulted over the railing of the 12-foot-high box to the stage below. He caught his spur on the Treasury Guard flag that was decorating the box, which caused him to land awkwardly on the stage, breaking his left leg. Despite the intense pain, Booth scrambled to his feet. He stood center stage, a figure of pure menace in the stunned silence that was now falling over the theatre. He raised his bloody dagger and, in a loud, dramatic voice, shouted "Sic semper tyrannis." This is a Latin phrase meaning "thus always to tyrants," the state motto of Virginia, and a phrase historically associated with assassination. Some witnesses also reported he shouted, "The South is avenged." This was the moment the dreamlike confusion shattered and the horrifying reality began to sink in. The audience stared, first in disbelief, then in dawning horror. Was this part of the play? Who was that man? He was an actor they recognized, but this was not in the script. The sight of the real blood on his dagger, his wild eyes, and his desperate cry turned the theatre into a scene of pandemonium. People began to scream. Some stood on their chairs, trying to get a better look. Others began to panic, pushing toward the exits. Booth, fueled by adrenaline, limped across the stage, pushing aside startled actors who were just as confused as the audience. He made his way to a side exit where a horse was being held for him in the alley behind the theater. He mounted the horse and galloped off into the darkness of the Washington night, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos and a nation on the brink of a new kind of despair. Back in the presidential box, the gravity of the situation was becoming terrifyingly clear. Mary Todd Lincoln's initial confusion gave way to a piercing scream as she saw her husband slumped forward in his chair. Major Rathbone, despite his own severe injury, cried out, "Stop that man!" A young doctor in the audience, Charles Leale, was one of the first to react. Recognizing the urgency, he pushed his way through the panicked crowd and climbed up into the box. Dr. Leale found the president unresponsive, barely breathing. He quickly located the wound, a small, dark hole behind the left ear. He knew instantly that the injury was mortal. There was nothing that could be done to save him. The primary goal now was to make the president as comfortable as possible. Assisted by other doctors who had made their way to the box, they decided against trying to move him back to the White House. The journey itself would likely be too much for him. Instead, a group of soldiers and civilians carefully carried the president out of the theater. The festive atmosphere of just moments before had evaporated, replaced by a somber, weeping crowd that had gathered outside. They carried him across the street to a boarding house, the Peterson House. There, in a small back bedroom, they laid the president diagonally across a bed that was too short for his tall frame. Throughout the night, a somber vigil was held. Cabinet members, government officials, and close friends gathered in the small, crowded house. Their faces etched with grief and disbelief. Mary Todd Lincoln was inconsolable, her cries of anguish echoing through the quiet rooms. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a man known for his stoicism, took charge of the situation, turning a nearby parlor into a makeshift command center. He began issuing orders, initiating the manhunt for Booth and his co-conspirators, and trying to maintain a semblance of order in a government that had just been decapitated. As the news spread through the city via telegraph, Washington, D.C. descended into a state of shock and mourning. Church bells began to toll, a mournful sound that would soon be echoed in towns and cities across the country. People poured into the streets, gathering in stunned, silent groups, trying to process the unthinkable news. The man who had saved the Union, who had spoken of malice toward none, with charity for all, was now lying on his deathbed, the victim of that very malice he had sought to overcome. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He never regained consciousness. Upon his passing, Secretary of War Stanton famously, and perhaps apocryphally, uttered the words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The laughter of our American cousin had been silenced, replaced by the profound silence of a nation's grief. The promise of a peaceful new dawn was now shrouded in the darkness of an assassination that would forever change the narrative of America's healing. The chapter of war had closed, but a new, painful chapter of loss and uncertainty had just begun. Thank you for joining us for this somber but important part of our history. The story of what happened next, the largest manhunt in American history, and the fate of the conspirators is a story for another time. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next chapter.
Welcome back to our series. Today, we delve into Chapter 15, Chaos in the Capitol. Picture this: Washington, D.C., a city on the precipice of pandemonium. It's a cool spring evening, but the air is thick, not with the scent of cherry blossoms, but with an electric tension, a palpable sense of dread. The year is 1865. The Civil War has just ended, and the nation is breathing a collective sigh of relief, fragile yet hopeful. But that hope is about to be shattered. The first whispers of tragedy begin to snake their way through the city's cobblestone streets. It starts as a rumor, a hushed word exchanged between two men on a dark corner, then another, spreading like a contagion. A telegraph operator, his face pale and his hands trembling, passes a slip of paper to a journalist. The message is short, cryptic, but its implications are monstrous. In the grand hotels and smoky saloons, the news travels faster than a galloping horse. "Have you heard, people ask, their voices low, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. It can't be true. But the rumor solidifies into fact with the deafening clang of bells. It begins with a single church, its bell tolling a frantic, irregular rhythm, not the celebratory peal of victory, but a somber, urgent alarm. Soon, another church joins in, then another, until the entire city is enveloped in a cacophony of sorrow. The sound is inescapable, a relentless hammer blow against the heart of the capital. It's the sound of a nation's worst fears realized. People spill out of their homes, their workplaces, their theaters. They pour into the streets, drawn by the mournful bells and a primal need to be with others. The gaslights cast long, dancing shadows on a sea of anxious faces. Strangers turn to each other, their social barriers dissolved by a shared, unfolding horror. "The president," they stammer, the word catching in their throats. At Ford's Theater, the initial reaction is pure disbelief. It's a hoax, a cruel joke. The president is a symbol of strength, of the Union's hard-won victory. He is untouchable, immortal. How could this happen? How could anyone dare? The war was over. The fighting was done. This was supposed to be a time of healing, of reconciliation, of rebuilding. This act of violence feels like a betrayal of that nascent peace, a plunge back into the darkness they had all just struggled to escape. As more details emerge, trickling in from eyewitnesses fleeing the theater, disbelief curdles into a cold, sickening fear. Descriptions of the scene are fragmented, chaotic. A single shot, a man leaping from the presidential box. A scream. The details are jumbled, but the core of the story remains terrifyingly consistent. The president has been shot. Crowds begin to form spontaneously. They gather outside the White House, its windows dark and imposing, as if it too is in mourning. They surge towards Pennsylvania Avenue, a river of humanity flowing towards the source of the tragedy. They stand in front of the War Department, where lanterns are being hastily lit, and officials can be seen moving frantically behind the windows. The city's pulse is racing, its breath held in a collective gasp. In the faces of the crowd, you can see every shade of grief. There are the soldiers, men who had faced death on the battlefield, now standing with tears streaming down their weathered cheeks. There are the women, clutching their shawls and their children, their faces masks of pure anguish. There are the formerly enslaved, for whom the president represented a Moses-like figure, a liberator. For them, this is not just the death of a leader, it's the death of a promise, the extinguishing of a beacon of hope. Their wails and prayers rise above the din of the bells, a raw and powerful expression of loss. Fear is a living thing in the streets that night. It's the fear of what comes next. If the president can be struck down, Isandon Safe, is the war truly over? Or is this the first shot of a new, more insidious conflict? Conspiracies bloom in the fertile ground of uncertainty. Was this a lone actor, or was it a plot? A last desperate act of a defeated enemy, designed to decapitate the government and throw the Union back into chaos. Rumors fly about other assassinations, of other government officials being targeted. The city, which had just celebrated the end of 4 years of bloodshed, is now braced for more. The crowds are not violent, not yet. They are stunned, a massive organism paralyzed by shock. They move aimlessly, searching for answers, for comfort, for a sign that this is all a terrible nightmare from which they will soon awaken. They look to the sky, as if expecting a sign. They look to each other, their eyes asking the same silent question. What now? Officials on horseback try to navigate the throng, their calls for order lost in the swell of human emotion. The city's police force, small and overwhelmed, can do little more than watch as the capital they are sworn to protect ascends into a state of emotional anarchy. The authority, the structure, the very sense of order that a government provides seems to have vanished in the puff of smoke from a single pistol. Imagine standing in that crowd, the cold night air, the smell of gas lamps and damp earth, the unrelenting, soul-shaking tolling of the bells, the murmurs, the sobs, the sudden shouts. The faces around you, illuminated by flickering light, are a mosaic of a nation's grief. You feel a profound sense of dislocation, as if the ground has fallen away beneath your feet. The man who had steered the ship of state through the stormiest of seas is gone. The captain has fallen. The hours stretch on, each minute an eternity. The initial frenzy gives way to a heavy, suffocating blanket of sorrow. The crowds don't disperse. Where would they go? Home offers no solace, only isolation. Here, in the street, amidst the shared grief of thousands, there is a strange, sad comfort. They are witnesses to history, a terrible, world-altering history, and they are bearing that burden together. News arrives that the president has been moved from the theater to a boarding house across the street. The crowd shifts, a slow, mournful migration towards this new focal point. They stand in a silent vigil, their faces turned towards the humble house where their leader is fighting for his life. A light burns in an upstairs window, a small beacon in the overwhelming darkness. Behind that window, the fate of the nation is being decided. The fear is not just for the man, but for the country. He had spoken of malice toward none, with charity for all. He was the architect of a gentle peace. Without him, what would happen? Would the hardliners take control? Would the desire for vengeance overwhelm the need for reconciliation? Would the wounds of the war, so fresh and deep, be torn open once more? These are the questions haunting the people of Washington, haunting the entire country. The chaos in the capital is not just in the crowded streets and the tolling bells. It's in the hearts and minds of every citizen. It's the chaos of a future suddenly rendered terrifyingly uncertain. This was the night Washington held its breath. A night of rumors, of bells, of crowds, and of a fear so profound it would be etched into the nation's memory forever. The calm after the storm of war had been shattered, replaced by a new storm, one of grief and uncertainty, with the capital city at its very heart. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story, as you know, does not end here. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, so you do unmiss what happens next as we continue to piece together this pivotal moment in history. We appreciate you being here. See you in the next video. The flickering gaslights of Washington cast long, distorted shadows as a small group of soldiers and civilians carried the limp form of the president across 10th Street. The joy and celebration that had filled Fortis Theater just moments before had curdled into a nightmare of confusion and horror. They found refuge in a modest boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. The house, ordinarian every way, was about to become the final, somber stage for one of American history's greatest tragedies. They carried Lincoln into a small, sparsely furnished back bedroom. The bed, far too short for his tall frame, forced them to lay him diagonally, his long legs extending off the edge. It was a humble, almost surreal setting for the end of such a monumental life. The room was cramped, barely large enough for the doctors, who immediately began their grim work. Dr. Charles Leali, the young army surgeon who had been the first to reach the president in the theater box, led the initial examination. The diagnosis was swift and hopeless. The bullet had entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. There was nothing they could do. The wound was mortal. As the gravity of the situation settled, the small room began to fill with an ever-growing crowd of officials, cabinet members, and friends. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrived, his usual gruff demeanor shattered by the unfolding catastrophe. He quickly took charge, turning the adjacent front parlor into a makeshift command center for the United States government. Through the long, agonizing night, Stanton, with his wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, dictated telegrams, interviewed witnesses, and began the hunt for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators. He was a rock of grim efficiency in a sea of grief, desperately trying to hold the reins of a nation suddenly without its leader. Inside the bedroom, the atmosphere was one of profound and heavy silence, broken only by the president's labored, rhythmic breathing and the soft weeping of those present. Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, was inconsolable. She would periodically come into the room, cry out in anguish at the sight of her husband, and then be gently led away by friends, her grief too raw and overwhelming for the quiet solemnity of the vigil. Their son, Robert Todd Lincoln, stood by, trying to offer what little comfort he could, his own face a mask of stunned disbelief. He'd already lost 2 younger brothers. Now he was losing his father. Surgeons and physicians came and went, checking the president's pulse, wiping his brow, and offering what little comfort was possible. They knew their efforts were futile, but they maintained their watch, a silent honor guard for the dying commander-in-chief. Through the night, prominent figures of Washington society and government cycled through the small house, paying their last respects. Senator Charles Sumner, a close friend of Lincoln's, sat by the bedside for hours, holding the president's hand, his own face streaked with tears. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles documented the scene in his diary, his precise, bureaucratic language straining to capture the immense weight of the moment. The vigil was a microcosm of the nation itself. Stunned, heartbroken, and uncertain, these powerful men, who had guided the Union through 4 years of brutal civil war, were now helpless onlookers. They had witnessed Lincoln's strength, his resolve, his humor, and his deep empathy. They had argued with him, advised him, and ultimately followed him. Now, they could only watch as the life force slowly ebbed from the man who had single-handedly held the nation together. The rhythmic, almost mechanical breathing of the president was a constant, haunting reminder of the life that was slipping away. Each breath seemed to mark the passing of an era. Outside the Peterson house, a crowd gathered in the muddy street, their numbers swelling as the news spread through the city like a virus. They stood in the pre-dawn chill, their faces upturned towards the window of the small bedroom, illuminated by a single lamp. They were a silent, grieving mass of soldiers, government clerks, and ordinary citizens, black and white, united in their shock and sorrow. They were a visual representation of the entire country, holding its collective breath, praying for a miracle they knew would not come. The news had traveled by telegraph, and by morning, the entire nation was aware that its leader lay dying. A deep, profound sadness fell over the land, from the bustling cities of the North to the war-ravaged towns of the South, as dawn approached on April 15, 1865. The gray light filtered into the crowded room, illuminating the exhausted, grief-stricken faces of those who had kept watch all night. The president's breathing became shallower, the pauses between each breath growing longer. The doctors noted the slowing pulse, the fading signs of life. The end was near. Reverend Phineas Gurley, pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which the Lincolns attended, offered a final, quiet prayer. The room fell into an absolute, profound silence. At precisely 7:22 in the morning, Abraham Lincoln drew his last breath. Dr. Lairley gently folded the president's hands over his chest. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was absolute, heavier and more complete than any sound. Then, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had been a tireless force throughout the night, finally broke. He looked upon the still face of the president and uttered the words that would echo through history, a perfect and somber epitaph. For the fallen leader, now he belongs to the ages. With those words, the vigil ended. The men in the room, exhausted and emotionally shattered, began to file out, leaving the great emancipator to the silence and the history he had so profoundly shaped. The news was carried out to the crowd waiting in the street, and a wave of audible sorrow rippled through them. The church bells of Washington began to toll, a mournful sound that would soon be taken up by bells in every city and town across the grieving nation. The man who had saved the Union, who had preached malice toward none and charity for all, was gone. The difficult, uncertain task of healing a wounded nation would have to continue without its chief architect. The final hours of Abraham Lincoln were over, but his legacy, secured in that small, crowded room, was just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. We'll see you next time. The early morning of April 15th, 1865, dawned gray and heavy over Washington, D.C. Inside a small, unassuming room in a boarding house across from Ford's Theater, a great light was flickering out. The air was thick with the hushed whispers of doctors and the stifled sobs of those who had kept vigil through the long, agonizing night. At 22 minutes past 7 o'clock, the vigil ended. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was gone. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a man not known for his sentimentality, broke the solemn silence. His voice, thick with emotion, uttered the words that would echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. And with that pronouncement, a chapter of American history closed, and a period of profound national grief began. The news of Lincoln's assassination, and now his death, spread like a shockwave, first through the streets of Washington and then, carried by the clicking teeth of the telegraph, to every corner of a nation still reeling from 4 years of brutal civil war. Just days earlier, the country had been celebrating. The surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox had signaled the end of the conflict that had torn the nation apart. Victory bells had pealed, fireworks had lit up the night sky, and a collective sigh of relief had swept across the northern states. The future, though challenging, seemed bright with the promise of reconciliation and reunion under Lincoln's steady hand. He had spoken of binding up the nation's wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all. His vision was not one of vengeance, but of healing. Now, the architect of that peace was gone, struck down at the very moment of his greatest triumph. As the news traveled, disbelief gave way to a deep, collective sorrow. In cities and towns, on farms, and in frontier settlements, people gathered in stunned silence. Strangers wept openly in the streets, clutching newspapers with headlines that seemed too terrible to be true. The joy of victory was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, numbing despair. The man who had saved the Union, the great emancipator who had broken the chains of millions, had been murdered. The sense of personal loss was immense. Many felt as though they had lost a father. Across the country, the symbols of mourning began to appear. Church bells, which had so recently rung in celebration, now told a slow, somber rhythm. In a spontaneous, nationwide gesture, flags were lowered to half. From the grand federal buildings in Washington to the smallest one-room schoolhouses on the prairie, the star-spangled banner drooped in a display of shared grief. Businesses closed their doors. Theaters, concert halls, and places of amusement went dark. The nation seemed to collectively hold its breath, unsure of what would come next. The visual landscape of America transformed almost overnight. Buildings were draped in black crepe. Portraits of Lincoln, often framed in black, appeared in countless windows, a silent tribute to the fallen leader. The demand for mourning cloth was so great that stores quickly ran out of black fabric, and people resorted to using any dark material they could find. This sea of black that draped the nation was more than just a custom. It was the outward expression of an inner anguish, a visible testament to the depth of the country's loss. In the South, the reaction was more complex. While some celebrated the death of the man they considered their conqueror, many others, including former Confederate leaders, were filled with a sense of dread. They understood that Lincoln's policy of merciful Reconstruction was their best hope for a peaceful return to the Union. They feared, correctly, that his death would empower radical Republicans in Congress who sought to punish the South for the war. General Joseph E. Johnston, a Confederate commander, reportedly said upon hearing the news, "The loss is an irreparable one to the South." He recognized that the bullet that killed Lincoln had also struck a blow against the hope for a gentle and swift reconciliation. For the newly freed African Americans, the news was utterly devastating. Lincoln was more than just a president. He was their Moses, the one who had led them out of bondage. His Emancipation Proclamation had been their declaration of freedom, and his life had been inextricably linked to their hopes for a future of equality and justice. His death felt like a terrifying abandonment. Who would protect them now? Who would champion their cause? In their communities, the mourning was perhaps the most profound, a mixture of deep sorrow and acute fear for what the future might hold without their protector. Back in Washington, Lincoln's body was moved from the Peterson House to the White House, escorted by a somber procession of soldiers and government officials. It lay in state in the East Room, which had been transformed into a grand funeral chamber. For days, a seemingly endless line of citizens, thousands upon thousands, snaked through the streets of the Capitol for a chance to pay their last respects. They came from all walks of life, sinners and soldiers, clerks and laborers, black and white, rich and poor. They filed past the open casket in silence, many in tears, to look upon the face of the man who had steered their country through its darkest hour. But the nation's farewell was not confined to Washington. It was decided that Lincoln would be taken home, back to Springfield, Illinois, for burial. The journey would retrace, in reverse, much of the route he had taken to Washington as president-elect in 1861. A special funeral train was prepared, a 9-car train draped in black, to carry the president on his final journey. This 2.5-week, 1,700-mile procession would become one of the most remarkable outpourings of public grief in American history. The train left Washington on April 21st, beginning a slow, mournful trek through the heart of the nation. It passed through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Indiana, and finally, Illinois. At major cities like Philadelphia, New York City, Cleveland, and Chicago. The casket was removed from the train and taken in grand processions to lie in state, allowing hundreds of thousands more to view their fallen president. In Philadelphia, the line to see him was 3 miles long. In New York, an estimated 500,000 people watched the funeral procession. But it wasn't just the big cities. All along the route, in small towns and at rural crossroads, people gathered day and night. They stood for hours, often in the rain, just to catch a glimpse of the train as it passed. They built bonfires by the tracks to light the way for the train at night. They sang hymns, they prayed, and they stood in silent, reverent tribute. Entire communities turned out, schools were dismissed, and farms were left untended. This funeral procession was a shared national experience, a way for the American people to collectively process their grief and honor the leader who had given his last full measure of devotion to the nation he loved. The sheer scale of this mourning was unprecedented. It was a testament not just to the office of the presidency, but to the man himself. Abraham Lincoln had become a deeply personal figure to the American people. His folksy wisdom, his humility, his perseverance through personal tragedy and national crises, and his unwavering commitment to the Union had forged a powerful bond. He was Father Abraham, a leader who seemed to embody the very soul of the nation he fought so hard to preserve. Finally, on May 3rd, the funeral train arrived in Springfield, the city Lincoln had called home for a quarter of a century. The boy who had arrived in Illinois as a poor, uneducated rail splitter was returning as a martyred hero. He lay in state one last time in the Illinois state capitol, where he had delivered his famous House-divided speech. The next day, he was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The death of Abraham Lincoln did not end the story of America, but it profoundly altered its course. The difficult work of reconstruction would proceed without his moderating influence, leading to a period of conflict and turmoil. The nation, plunged into mourning, had lost its guide at the very moment it needed him most. The flags that were lowered in April of 1865 were a symbol of a nation in sorrow, but they also marked the end of an era. The president was gone, but his legacy, the vision of a united nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, would endure. He now belonged to the ages and to the heart of the nation he had saved. Thank you for watching this chapter of our journey through history. If you found this story as moving as we did, please Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We'll see you next time. As President Lincoln drew his last breath, his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was already a man on the run, galloping through the darkened streets of Washington. The city, still reeling from the shock of the attack, was quickly locked down. Soldiers swarmed the exits, but Booth, with a chilling mix of luck and calculation, had managed to slip through the net just moments before it closed. His escape route was a desperate, pre-planned path into the Maryland countryside, a path he hoped would lead him to safety and a hero's welcome in the South. Booth wasn't alone in his flight. He soon met up with his accomplice, David Harold. Together, they navigated the treacherous terrain under the cover of darkness. Booth's leg, broken during his leap from the presidential box at Ford's Theater, was a source of constant, agonizing pain. The injury slowed them down significantly, forcing them to seek help. Their first major stop was the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician who knew Booth. Mudd. Mudd set the broken bone and provided them with a place to rest, a decision that would later cost him dearly. Unaware of the full gravity of the situation at first, or perhaps choosing to ignore it, Dr. Mudd aided a man who was now the most wanted fugitive in American history. As news of Lincoln's death spread like wildfire, a wave of grief and rage swept across the nation. The government, led by a furious Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, launched one of the largest manhunts in history. A staggering $100,000 reward was offered for Booth's capture, an immense sum at the time, equivalent to millions today. Thousands of Union soldiers and federal agents were deployed, combing through every town, swamp, and forest. Telegraph wires buzzed with Booth's description, and newspapers printed his photograph, making his famous face a liability. The entire country was on alert. Every stranger was viewed with suspicion, and the search for the assassin became a national obsession. Booth and Harold's journey south was fraught with peril. They were fugitives in a land that was rapidly turning against them. The hero's welcome Booth had envisioned from Confederate sympathizers never materialized. Instead, they found fear and rejection. The cause he thought he was serving had crumbled, and the people he expected to embrace him now saw him as a dangerous liability, a man who brought nothing but trouble. They were turned away from homes, denied aid, and forced to hide in dense woods and swamps, living like animals. The pain from Booth's leg was relentless, and his initial arrogance began to curdle into despair. For 12 long days, they evaded capture. They crossed the Potomac River into Virginia, hoping for a warmer reception, but found none. Their desperation grew with each passing day. Booth kept a diary during his flight, and its pages reveal a man bewildered by the world's condemnation. He saw himself as a patriot, a modern-day Brutus, but the world saw him as a villain, a common murderer. He wrote of his disappointment, his pain, and his unshakable belief that he had done the right thing, even as the world hunted him down. Our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done, he wrote. But the grand gesture had backfired spectacularly. The net was closing in. The fugitives' luck finally ran out on April 26, 1865, acting on a tip. A detachment of the 16th New York Cavalry surrounded a tobacco barn on Richard Garrett S. Farm in Virginia. Inside were Booth and Harold. The soldiers called for their surrender. After a tense standoff, David Harold, losing his nerve, gave himself up and walked out of the barn. But Booth refused. He was defiant to the end, perhaps seeking a dramatic final confrontation. Unwilling to risk a direct assault that might allow Booth to escape, the soldiers decided to smoke him out. They set the barn on fire. The dry tobacco leaves and wood ignited quickly, and the structure was engulfed in flames. Silhouetted against the raging fire, Booth was a visible target. As he moved inside the inferno, a sergeant named Boston Corbett peered through a crack in the barn wall and raised his revolver. Against direct orders to take Booth alive, Corbett fired a single shot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. Soldiers dragged Booth's paralyzed body from the burning barn. He was laid on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse, alive but unable to move. The bullet had entered in almost the exact same spot where Lincoln had been shot. As dawn broke, Booth lingered for a few hours. He was in agony, yet his vanity remained. He whispered to one of the soldiers, asking him to lift his hands so he could see them. Looking at his motionless hands, he uttered his final words. Useless. Useless. With that, The life of the man who had murdered a president and thrown a nation into chaos came to a quiet, pathetic end. The manhunt was over, but the consequences of his actions would echo through American history for generations to come. A dark final chapter to a brutal civil war. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of history as compelling as I did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. See you next time. Welcome back to our deep dive into one of history's most dramatic men. Today, we've reached the final, gripping chapter. The end of the assassin, John Wilkes Booth. After assassinating President Lincoln, Booth was no longer a celebrated actor but the most wanted man in America. For 12 long days, he was a fugitive, a shadow moving through the night. Let's set the scene. It's April 1865. The nation is raw with grief, and a massive manhunt is underway. Thousands of soldiers and detectives are scouring the countryside, fueled by a thirst for justice and a staggering $100,000 reward. Booth, accompanied by his accomplice David Harold, fled south from Washington. He was injured, his leg broken from his leap onto the stage at Ford's Theater, a theatrical escape that turned into a painful, desperate reality. Their journey was fraught with danger. They navigated through dense Maryland woods and swamps, relying on a network of Confederate sympathizers for shelter and aid. One of the most crucial stops was the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg. This act of assistance would later land Dr. Mudd in serious trouble, raising questions about his knowledge of the plot that are debated to this day. Was he an innocent doctor helping a stranger, or a willing conspirator? As Booth and Harold continued their flight, the dragnet was tightening. Every ferry, bridge, and road was being watched. The fugitives were constantly on the move, exhausted and paranoid. They managed to cross the Potomac River into Virginia, believing they would find a hero's welcome in the heart of the defeated Confederacy. They were sorely mistaken. The South they envisioned a place that would celebrate Lincoln's death didn't materialize. Instead, they found a war-weary populace that wanted nothing more to do with the conflict. They were turned away, viewed not as heroes, but as dangerous men bringing trouble to their doorsteps. The net was closing in, fast. The pursuers, led by the 16th New York Cavalry, were relentless. They picked up the trail, gathering intelligence from locals, some of whom were persuaded by the reward money, others by a sense of duty. The trail led them directly to the Garrett farm in Virginia. Richard Garrett, a farmer, had reluctantly allowed Booth and Harold to stay, initially believing they were Confederate soldiers. But his suspicions grew, and he eventually forced them to sleep in his tobacco barn, locking them in for the night. This would be their final refuge. In the pre-dawn hours of April 26th, the soldiers surrounded the barn. Lieutenant Edward Duarte, the officer in charge, called out for them to surrender. Inside, a tense negotiation began. David Harold, seeing the hopeless situation, quickly gave himself up, leaving Booth alone inside. But Booth was defiant. He was a performer to the very end, and this was his final act. He shouted back, "I will not be taken alive." He tried to bargain, asking the soldiers to back off and give him a chance to fight his way out. His request was denied. The soldiers knew they couldn't risk a direct assault. The solution was as brutal as it was effective. They set the barn on fire. The dry tobacco and wood went up in a blaze, illuminating the night and forcing Booth out of the shadows, silhouetted against the flames. He was a clear target. Through the slats of the barn, a soldier named Boston Corbett could see Booth moving inside, armed and seemingly preparing to fire. Against orders to take Booth alive, Corbett raised his revolver and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. It was a wound eerily similar to the one that killed President Lincoln. Paralyzed and dying, Booth was dragged from the burning barn and laid on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. As the sun rose, he lingered for a few hours. In his final moments, he whispered for his hands to be raised to his face. Staring at them, he uttered his last words. Useless, useless. It was a tragic, pathetic end for a man who craved glory and fame. His grand, historic act had brought him nothing but a painful death in a dusty farmyard. With Booth's death, the main part of the manhunt was over. His body was transported back to Washington, where it was secretly autopsied and buried. The government wanted to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for sympathizers. His co-conspirators, including David Herold and Mary Surratt, were quickly tried by a military tribunal. 4 of them were hanged, including Surratt, the first woman executed by the United States federal government. Others were sentenced to long prison terms. But the end of the chase didn't mean the end of the questions. Justice was served, but was it complete? The speed and nature of the military trial raised concerns about due process, and conspiracy theories began to swirl almost immediately. Was the plot bigger than just Booth and his small circle? Did high-ranking Confederate officials have a hand in it? Some even claimed that it wasn't Booth who was killed in the barn, that he had somehow escaped and lived for years under a different identity. These theories, though largely debunked by historians, speak to the deep shock and confusion that gripped the nation. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a wound that wouldn't easily heal, and the dramatic, violent end of his killer became a legend in itself. The story of John Wilkes Booth is a cautionary tale about the destructive power of fanaticism and the dark allure of infamy. It's a reminder that history is not just about grand events, but also about the very human, and often flawed, individuals who shaped them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a dark and fascinating chapter of American history. I hope this gave you a clearer picture of the final days of one of the nation's most notorious figures. If you found this interesting, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let me know in the comments what you think about Booth's end and the unanswered questions that still linger. See you next time. Imagine a train, draped in black, slowly making its way across a vast nation. This isn't just any train. It's carrying the body of a fallen leader, a man who became a symbol of unity and freedom. This was the scene in the spring of 1865. As the United States mourned the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, his death plunged the country, already scarred by 4 years of brutal civil war, into a profound and collective grief. The man who had fought so hard to preserve the Union was gone, and an entire nation was left to grapple with the loss. This final journey was a funeral procession unlike any other in American history. The train, officially named the Lincoln Special, was tasked with carrying his remains from Washington, D.C., back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The route was carefully planned, stretching nearly 1,700 miles, retracing in reverse the path Lincoln had taken to the Capitol for his inauguration just a few years earlier. It was a journey through the heart of the nation he had saved, a final farewell tour that allowed the people to say goodbye. As the train departed from Washington, the air was thick with sorrow. The initial ceremony in the Capitol was a somber affair, attended by dignitaries and officials. But the true measure of the nation's grief was revealed as the train moved northward and then westward. In every city and town along the route, Philadelphia, New York City, Cleveland, Indianapolis, the casket was taken from the train and placed in a public building for viewing. State houses, city halls, and public squares became temporary shrines where hundreds of thousands of people could file past the open casket. The sheer scale of this public mourning was unprecedented. In Philadelphia, Lincoln lay in state, in the very hall where the Declaration of Independence was signed, a powerful symbol of the ideals he fought to uphold. The lines of people stretched for miles, a silent, patient river of humanity. They waited 4 hours, sometimes all day and through the night, just for a fleeting glimpse of their fallen president. They were people from all walks of life, wealthy merchants, poor laborers, farmers, mothers with children, and, most poignantly, soldiers in their blue uniforms, many of whom had fought and bled for the cause Lincoln represented. In New York City, the procession was a spectacle of immense sorrow. The hearse, drawn by 16 gray horses draped in black, moved slowly through streets lined with an estimated 1 million spectators. Buildings were shrouded in black crepe, flags flew at half-mast, and the only sounds were the tolling of church bells and the soft weeping of the crowd. It was a city brought to a standstill, united in a shared sense of loss. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe the scene as overwhelmingly powerful, a silent testament to the depth of the nation's affection and respect for the man who had guided them through their darkest hours. But perhaps the most touching displays of mourning occurred not in the grand cities, but in the small towns and rural landscapes between them. The railroad tracks became a continuous line of mourners. As the funeral train chugged slowly through the countryside, often at just 5 miles per hour, people gathered by the thousands along the tracks. They stood in open fields, on hillsides, and at small rural crossings, holding lanterns and torches to light the way for their president's final journey home. Farmers left their plows in the fields. School children were brought out by their teachers. Entire families stood in silent vigil, their faces illuminated by bonfires they had built beside the tracks. They held handmade signs with simple messages like "We mourn our loss" or "Farewell, Father Abraham." Many had never met Lincoln, never heard his voice in person, but they felt they knew him. He was the storyteller from the frontier, the plain-spoken lawyer who had risen to the highest office, the man who'd freed the slaves and held the nation together. To them, he was not just a president. He was a father figure, a protector. The tears shed by these millions of ordinary Americans were genuine and heartfelt. They cried for the man, for the leader they had lost. They cried for the future of the country, now uncertain. They cried for the immense cost of the war and for the hope of reconciliation that Lincoln had embodied. One journalist traveling on the funeral train wrote of looking out the window at night and seeing a continuous line of fire and faces stretching for miles into the darkness. Each bonfire, each lantern, was a small beacon of remembrance, a personal tribute from a grateful citizen. This outpouring of grief was not just about the man himself, but what he represented. Lincoln's assassination, coming just days after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, felt like a cruel final blow. The war was over, but the architect of the peace was gone. His vision of a just and lasting peace, with malice toward none, with charity for all, was now left in the hands of others. The nation mourned not just a president, but the loss of a guiding light at the very moment it was most needed. Finally, after a journey of nearly 2 weeks, the Lincoln Special arrived in Springfield, Illinois. Here, in the town where he had built his career and raised his family, he was laid to rest. The boy from the log cabin had come home. His funeral procession had been a long, painful, but ultimately unifying experience for the northern states. It allowed millions to participate directly in the national mourning, to feel a personal connection to the historic moment. The sight of citizens lining the tracks, of tears on the faces of people who had only known him through newspapers and stories, revealed the profound bond between Lincoln and the American people. He was their president, their commander-in-chief, but he was also Father Abraham. His long journey home was a testament to the love and reverence they held for him, transforming a national tragedy into a shared, sacred memory that would be etched into the soul of the nation forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into history moving, please consider subscribing for more stories like this. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into the final chapter of our series on Abraham Lincoln, exploring the profound and enduring legacy he left behind. How is a leader, especially one who presided over such a tumultuous period, remembered by history? For Lincoln, the answer is complex, multifaceted, and continues to evolve even today. His assassination just days after the Civil War ended cemented his status as a martyr for the Union, a savior who had steered the nation through its darkest hour. For many in the North, he was the embodiment of American ideals, humble, honest, and resolute. His image was quickly immortalized in statues, on currency, and in the hearts of a grateful nation. In the South, however, the memory was far more complicated. Initially, he was seen as the architect of their defeat, a tyrant who had crushed their way of life. But over time, even there, a grudging respect began to emerge for the man who sought reconciliation with malice toward none, with charity for all. This dual memory highlights the deep divisions he had to navigate and the monumental task of healing that lay ahead for the country. Of course, no discussion of Lincoln's legacy is complete without focusing on his role in ending slavery. This is, without a doubt, the cornerstone of how he is remembered. It's fascinating to trace his evolution on this issue. He wasn't always a radical abolitionist. Initially, his primary goal was to preserve the Union, and he believed that if he could do so without freeing any slaves, he would. But the moral and military realities of the war pushed him forward. He came to see that the Union could not be truly saved if the cancer of slavery remained. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point, not just for the war, but for the very soul of America. It transformed the conflict from a war to preserve the nation into a war for human freedom. By the time the 13th Amendment was passed, permanently abolishing slavery, Lincoln had firmly embraced the cause. He became, for millions of African Americans, the great emancipator. This title, while debated by some historians who emphasize the role of enslaved people in their own liberation, captures the immense symbolic and practical power of his actions. He used the authority of his office to strike a decisive blow against an institution that had stained the nation for centuries. Lincoln's legacy also extends deep into the fabric of American democracy. His leadership fundamentally reshaped the presidency and the federal government. Before the Civil War, the United States was often seen as a loose confederation of sovereign states. Lincoln argued, and ultimately proved through force of arms, that it was one nation, indivisible. He asserted the power of the federal government to preserve that nation, setting a precedent that would be followed by future presidents in times of crisis. His most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, redefined the very meaning of the American experiment. He didn't just talk about a political union, he talked about a nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He framed the war as a test of whether a government of the people, people for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This powerful vision of a government accountable to its citizens, a democracy based on equality and liberty, became the new moral compass for the nation. It was a promise that America is still striving to live up to. He showed that democracy wasn't just about processes and laws, it was about ideals worth fighting and dying for. Beyond the grand political strokes, Lincoln's personal story contributes immensely to his legacy. His journey from a log cabin to the White House is the quintessential American dream. It represents the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, can rise to the highest echelons through hard work, intelligence, and character. He was a self-taught lawyer, a brilliant political strategist, and a master of the English language. His writings and speeches are studied not just for their historical content, but for their literary power and profound wisdom. Think about the eloquence of his second inaugural address, where he calls for healing and reconciliation. This combination of political genius and deep humanity makes him an endlessly fascinating figure. He was a man who bore the immense weight of the war on his shoulders, suffering personal tragedies like the death of his son Willie. Yet he never lost his sense of humor or his compassion for others. This blend of strength and humility, of political savvy and moral conviction, is what makes him so relatable and revered. So, how do all these threads come together? Lincoln's legacy is that of a transformational leader who saved the Union, freed the slaves, and redefined American democracy. He guided the nation through an existential crisis and, in doing so, helped it to be reborn. He wasn't a perfect man, and historians rightly continue to examine his complexities and contradictions. For example, his views on race were not always as enlightened as we might wish them to be by today's standards. But he demonstrated a remarkable capacity for growth. He was a leader who evolved, who listened, and who ultimately aligned himself with the moral arc of the universe, bending it more firmly toward justice. His influence is everywhere in the strength of the federal government, in the constitutional guarantee of freedom for all citizens, and in the very idea of what it means to be an American. He left a nation that was bruised and battered, but whole, a nation with a new birth of freedom. His work was unfinished, as the long and difficult struggle for civil rights in the following century would prove, but he laid the foundation. He set the course. In conclusion, Abraham Lincoln the looms large over American history because he presided over its most defining moment and articulated its highest ideals. He was the right man at the right time, a leader whose character was forged in the crucible of crises. His memory serves as a constant reminder of the fragility of democracy, the moral cost of injustice, and the power of leadership to guide a nation toward its better angels. His story is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a living testament to the ongoing American experiment. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. If you enjoyed this series, please give this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next video. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment in American history, one that's often overshadowed by the triumph of the Civil War's end. We're exploring the fragile peace that followed Abraham Lincoln's assassination and asking a crucial question. How did the loss of one man so drastically alter the course of a nation? Let's get into Chapter 22. The Fragile Peace after Lincoln. The year is 1865. The cannons have fallen silent, the smoke is cleared, and the Union is preserved. But America is a nation deeply wounded, grappling with questions that will define its future. How do you reunite a country torn apart by 4 years of brutal conflict? And more importantly, what is the place of nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans in this new America? These were the monumental tasks of Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln had already begun to sketch out his vision for this new era. His plan, often called the 10% Plan, was rooted in reconciliation and a relatively swift path for Southern states to rejoin the Union. He famously spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all, signaling a desire to heal the nation's wounds rather than punish the South. Lincoln understood that the road ahead required a delicate touch, a balance of justice and mercy. He favored a lenient approach, believing it was the fastest way to stitch the fabric of the nation back together. His focus was on reunion, on bringing the prodigal states back into the fold as painlessly as possible. But then, on April 14, 1865, a single gunshot at Ford's Theater changed everything. Lincoln was gone. The man who had steered the nation through its darkest hour was no longer at the helm. And with his death, the spirit of malice toward none was replaced by something far more volatile. Into this power vacuum stepped Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. On paper, he seemed like a potential bridge between North and South. But Johnson was no Lincoln. He lacked Lincoln's political genius, his moral clarity, and his profound empathy. Johnson was a staunch Unionist, but he was also a man of his time, holding deeply ingrained racist beliefs. While he despised the wealthy planter class he blamed for the war, he had little interest in securing genuine rights and protections for the formerly enslaved. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction quickly diverged from what Lincoln had envisioned. He implemented his own plan, which was even more lenient than Lincoln's. He offered pardons to thousands of former Confederates, allowing the old Southern elite to quickly regain power. Within months, the very same men who had led the rebellion were back in control of their state governments. And what did they do with that power? They enacted the Black Codes. These were a series of restrictive laws designed to control the labor and behavior of African Americans. They varied by state, but the goal was universal: to reestablish a system of near slavery. Black Codes limited property ownership, restricted the types of jobs freedmen could hold, and implemented vagrancy laws. They could force them back onto plantations if they were unemployed. It was a clear and defiant attempt to turn back the clock. The promise of freedom was being suffocated almost before it could draw its first breath. This blatant Southern resistance enraged the North. Many in Congress, particularly a group known as the Radical Republicans, were horrified. They saw Johnson's policies as a betrayal of everything the Union had fought for. Men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner believed that Reconstruction shouldn't just be about reuniting states. It had to be about fundamentally remaking Southern society. They argued for full citizenship and voting rights for African Americans, and for federal power to protect those rights. They saw this as a moral imperative, and the only way to secure lasting peace. This set the stage for an epic clash between President Johnson and Congress. The Radicals fought back against Johnson's agenda. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and pushed for the 14th Amendment, which would grant citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guarantee all citizens equal protection of the laws. When Johnson vetoed these measures, Congress overrode his vetoes, marking a dramatic power shift. The battle for the soul of Reconstruction had begun. So, how would Lincoln have handled this? It's one of history's great what-ifs. We can't know for sure, but we can make some educated guesses based on his character and political skill. Lincoln was a master politician, far more adept than Johnson at negotiation and compromise. He likely would have sought a middle ground between his own lenient policies and the Radicals' demands. He had shown a remarkable ability to evolve his thinking, especially on the issue of race and rights. It's plausible he would have eventually supported voting rights for at least some African Americans, particularly veterans. Unlike Johnson, who met opposition with stubborn defiance, Lincoln knew how to build coalitions. He would have used the power and prestige of his office to persuade, to bargain, and to isolate his opponents. He could have rallied public support in the North for a more just Reconstruction, framing it not as punishment for the South, but as the necessary fulfillment of America's promise of liberty. He would have faced immense challenges, no doubt, but it's hard to imagine him getting into the same kind of destructive, head-on collision with Congress that Johnson did. Lincoln's political savvy might have been the very ingredient needed to navigate the treacherous waters of Reconstruction without the process becoming so bitter and polarized. The failure to find that middle ground had devastating consequences. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson, though it failed by a single vote, left the presidency weakened and the country more divided than ever. The period of radical Reconstruction that followed saw federal troops stationed in the South and African Americans participating in government for the first time. It was a brief, revolutionary moment. Black men voted, held office, and helped draft new state constitutions. Public education systems were established for all children, a radical idea in the South at the time. But this progress was built on a fragile foundation. It was enforced by the military and fiercely resisted by many white Southerners, who organized violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize black communities and their white allies. The North, weary of conflict and focused on industrial growth, gradually lost its will to continue the fight. In 1877, a political compromise led to the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. What followed was the era of Jim Crow. The rights that had been gained were systematically stripped away. Segregation was legally enforced. Voting rights were eliminated through poll taxes and literacy tests. And a reign of racial terror descended upon the South. The future shaped by Lincoln's loss was one of broken promises. The new birth of freedom he had spoken of at Gettysburg was deferred for nearly a century. Lincoln's absence created a leadership vacuum that no one could adequately fill. His unique combination of moral authority, political skill, and commitment to both union and liberty was irreplaceable. Without him, the forces of reconciliation without justice, led by Johnson, and the forces of justice without widespread support, led by the radicals, fought to a stalemate. In the end, the nation chose the path of least resistance, abandoning the difficult work of building a truly multiracial democracy. The fragile peace after the Civil War shattered because the man best equipped to guard it was gone. The challenges of Reconstruction were immense, but Lincoln's death made them nearly insurmountable. His loss wasn't just the loss of a president, it was the loss of a vision of a healed and more just nation that would take another 100 years to even begin to realize. Thanks so much for watching. This is a complex and often painful part of history to discuss, but it's essential for understanding where we are today. If you found this video insightful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Welcome back to our series, where we journey through the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Today, we arrive at a somber, yet profoundly important chapter. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and why its echoes still resonate through time, more than a century and a half later. Why do we keep revisiting this tragic event? It's not just about a single moment of violence. It's about what that moment represented and the void it created. Lincoln's death wasn't just the loss of a president. It was a devastating blow to the fragile process of healing a nation torn apart by civil war. Imagine the United States in 1865. The cannons had fallen silent, but the wounds of conflict were raw and deep. The country was a fractured family, grappling with how to live together again. In this incredibly delicate moment, Lincoln stood as the primary architect of reconciliation. His vision wasn't about punishment or retribution for the defeated South. It was about malice toward none, with charity for all. He envisioned a reconstruction that would bind up the nation's wounds and create a lasting peace. When John Wilkes Booth fired that fateful shot, he didn't just kill a man. He assassinated a plan for unity. The leadership vacuum left by Lincoln's death was immense, and what followed was a much harsher, more contentious period of Reconstruction. The path to healing became steeper, the divisions more entrenched, and the struggle for civil rights for newly freed African Americans became immensely more difficult. The promises of emancipation were delayed and obstructed in ways Lincoln had hoped to prevent. So, when we study his assassination, we're studying the what if. What if his steady hand had guided the nation through those first crucial years of peace? How different would the next century of American history have been? The event serves as a stark reminder of how the actions of one individual can dramatically alter the course of history for millions. This brings us to the powerful lessons about leadership that emerge from Lincoln's life and untimely death. What made him such an effective leader, especially during a crisis of unimaginable scale? First, it was his profound empathy. Lincoln had this incredible ability to understand and connect with the perspectives of others. even those he disagreed with. He didn't demonize his opponents. He sought to understand their motivations. This empathy was the bedrock of his plan for a compassionate peace. He knew that to rebuild a nation, you couldn't just win on the battlefield. You had to win the hearts and minds of the people. His leadership was also defined by his unwavering commitment to a core principle: the preservation of the Union. Through the darkest days of the war, when victory seemed uncertain and the calls for a negotiated peace were loud, Lincoln never lost sight of this ultimate goal. Yet, his resolve was paired with remarkable flexibility. He was a master politician who understood the art of compromise and timing. Think about the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't issued at the start of the war. Lincoln waited for the right political and military moment to make it a strategic and moral masterpiece. He was a pragmatist, guided by a powerful moral compass. This blend of empathy, resolve, and pragmatism is a timeless model for leadership. It teaches us that true strength isn't about rigidness or aggression. It's about having the wisdom to know when to stand firm and when to build bridges. In our own polarized times, these lessons are more relevant than ever. We see leaders across the globe grappling with deep divisions, and Lincoln's example shows that unity is not achieved by force, but by understanding, by a shared vision, and by the courage to choose reconciliation over retribution. So, how does remembering this history help us protect the peace we have today? History is not just a collection of stories about the past. It's a map that helps us navigate the present and the future. The events surrounding Lincoln's assassination provide a critical case study in the fragility of democracy and the constant effort required to maintain it. It shows us how quickly progress can be undone by extremism and hatred. The political climate that led to Lincoln's death was one of intense polarization, misinformation, and demonization of the other side. Sound familiar? When we see these same patterns emerging in our own societies, history sounds an alarm bell. It reminds us that words have consequences, that division can fester into violence, and that the institutions that protect our peace and freedom need to be actively defended. Remembering Lincoln means remembering the fight for a more perfect union is a continuous one. It's a struggle that takes place not on battlefields, but in our communities, in our political discourse, and in our own hearts. It's about choosing to engage with those who are different from us, to listen with an open mind, and to reject the easy path of blame and division. Protecting peace means valuing the principles of dialogue, compromise, and mutual respect that Lincoln championed. It means understanding that a healthy society can and must accommodate disagreement without resorting to hatred. By studying the echoes of 1865, we arm ourselves with the wisdom to recognize the dangers of our time and the inspiration to work for a more united future. We honor Lincoln not by placing him on a pedestal, but by striving to live up to the ideals for which he gave his life. A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal. It's a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey we all must take together. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of history's most defining moments. The story of our past is filled with lessons that can guide us toward a better future. If you found this discussion valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to explore. Until next time, stay curious. And so, we arrive at this quiet place. After all the sound and the fury, after the grand adventures and the small, intimate moments, we find ourselves here, in a space of gentle reflection. The story, like a river finding its way to the sea, has reached a point of calm expanse. The ripples of what is past are now settling, becoming a part of the larger body of memory. It's a time not for action, but for being. A time to let the echoes of the journey wash over us, to feel the weight and the lightness of all that has happened. Think of it as the moments after a great piece of music has ended. The final note has faded, but the melody lingers in the air, in our minds, in the very feeling of the room. This is that silence. It's not empty. It's full. It's filled with the ghosts of laughter, the shadows of tears, the warmth of companionship, and the sting of farewells. Each scene, each character, each choice has left its indelible mark. And now is the time to trace those marks, not with frantic energy, but with a soft, understanding touch. This chapter isn't about pushing forward. It's about looking back, but not with longing or regret. It's about looking back with the wisdom that comes from having lived through it all. It's about understanding that every twist and turn, every unexpected detour, was necessary to bring us to this exact point of understanding. The narrative has woven itself into a complete tapestry. We can now step back and see the entire picture, appreciating how Mega's seemingly random thread contributed to the final, beautiful design. The colors, some bright and some dark, all work together in a harmony we might not have perceived while we were in the midst of it. So, let's take this moment. Let's breathe it in. Let the story settle within you, not as a collection of events, but as a feeling, a lesson, a part of your own journey now. This is a quiet harbor after a long voyage, a chance to rest our oars and simply float, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Each one a memory of the path we've traveled. It is a time to honor the journey by giving it the space to become a part of us, to integrate its lessons into the very fabric of our being. In this quiet reflection, we find the true meaning of the tale. It's not in the climax or the conclusion, but in the transformation that occurred along the way. The story was never just about what happened. It was about who we became while it was happening. And now, in this stillness, we can finally meet that person, the one who has walked this long road and is now standing here, changed, thoughtful, and at peace. It's a time for the heart to catch up with the head, for the soul to absorb what the eyes have seen. This is not an ending, but a transition. It's the gentle closing of a book, the scent of old paper and ink lingering in the air. The story is now yours to carry. It lives on, not on the page or the screen, but in your memory, in the way you see the world, in the quiet moments when you pause and remember. The adventure has concluded, but its spirit continues, a soft and steady light guiding you onward. Let's allow ourselves this gift of thoughtful rest, this peaceful interlude where the story becomes a cherished memory, a treasure held safely within. As we sit with these thoughts, let's appreciate the power of a story to change us. It's a quiet magic, one that works its way into our lives without us even noticing. It plants seeds of empathy, courage, and understanding. And in this period of reflection, we can see how those seeds have begun to sprout. We see the world filtered through the lens of the experiences we've shared, and it looks a little different, a little richer, a little more profound. This is the gift of the story's end, the beginning of its life within us. It is the moment the characters cease to be figures in a narrative and become companions in our minds. Their struggles become our lessons. Their triumphs our inspiration. The world they inhabited becomes a place we can revisit anytime we close our eyes and choose to remember. This quietude is an invitation to do just that, to walk back through the familiar paths of the story, not as a spectator, but as a knowing friend. It is a time to be grateful for the journey, grateful for the highs that made us soar and the lows that taught us resilience, grateful for the questions that were answered and for those that remain, sparking our curiosity and wonder. In this reflective state, gratitude flows icily, washing over the entire experience and leaving a sense of completeness and peace. The tale has run its course, and we are better for having been a part of it. So let the world outside fade away for a little while. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes, and let the story breathe. Feel its rhythm, its heartbeat. Let it settle like dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, each one a tiny, sparkling memory. This is your time to connect with the essence of the narrative, to find your own truth within its pages. The grand finale is over, and now the personal, intimate encore begins. It's a performance just for you, played on the strings of your own heart. This isn't a final goodbye. It's a see you later in a different form. The story doesn't vanish. It simply changes its address, moving from the external world into your internal landscape. It's there for you whenever you need it. A source of comfort, a jolt of courage, a reminder of a lesson learned. This quiet reflection is the process of unpacking the story and finding a permanent home for it within yourself. Let's honor this process. Let's give it the time and the silence it deserves. The adventure was for the thrill, but this moment, this quiet reflection, is for the soul. It's where the story truly becomes timeless, where it transcends its own telling and becomes a part of the greater human experience, passed on through the quiet power of memory. Thank you for taking this journey, and for now, in this shared silence, let's simply rest and reflect.